Ladies and gentlemen, the fact that something is stupid, the fact that something is shallow, doesn't mean that it's not important, especially in the sphere of politics. Political judgments involve decisions we make about more and less. Decisions of relative priority, relative privation, relative good, and relative evil. Do you have a whole lot of respect for Al Gore? When Al Gore dies, we all got to die someday. When there's a funeral for Al Gore, are you going to hug your grandchildren to you tightly and say, he was such a good man? He was such an inspiration to me. Al Gore, in 2022, is vegan. Since about 2013, he has publicly identified as vegan. Is Al Gore an inspiration to you? Do you look up to Al Gore? You think about the history of Afghanistan. When you think about the fate of Afghanistan, where today women are again being forcibly wrapped from head to toe in the most restrictive of Islamic garb, where women have lost the right to show their faces in public or even to show a tiny window onto their eyes. When you think about the 1,000-year history of Afghanistan, 500 years leading up to 2001, 500 years after 2001, the difference between Al Gore and George W. Bush really matters. Now, I wasn't born yesterday. I know some bad things about Al Gore. You don't have to look under any rocks. Okay, if you just get interested in the politics of that era, you're going to learn some bad things about Al Gore. If Al Gore were a personal friend of mine, I'd probably say that he was a bad man. I might be friends with him anyway. You can be friends with someone you think is kind of morally a bad person or what have you. There are probably numerous ways in which ethically I could find fault with Al Gore. When you compare Al Gore to George W. Bush, and I remember vividly the cynicism of the time. I remember newspaper articles boldly and self-righteously proclaiming that there was no point in voting because there was no meaningful difference between the two options you were being presented with. Al Gore versus George W. Bush. Really, there was a lot of that. I think that was the spirit of Kurt Cobain still kind of haunting the world. What was his genre of music called? I forget. Grunge. Yeah, the spirit of Seattle. That hyper resignation, hyper fatuous, hyper passive, Seattle rock view of the world is still kind of dominant in pop culture. This sense of resignation to one's fate and that there was no difference you could make in the world. Okay. Looking back now and knowing the moral character of George W. Bush, the intellectual caliber of George W. Bush, in contrast to Al Gore. Al Gore, who has published numerous books on ecology. Do I think his books on ecology are good? Do I think they're brilliant? Do I think they're inspirational? Do I even think they're morally or ethically wonderful? No. Again, when Al Gore dies, I'm not going to hug my daughter to me and say, oh, you don't know what a wonderful man Al Gore was. Or again, perhaps by then it'll be my grandchildren. Who knows how long a life he'll have, what have you. This is not my relationship to Al Gore. But if you think we can't judge, if you think we shouldn't judge, if you think, who am I to judge these distinctions of better or worse? All right. The United States of America would be a dramatically different country today if we had endured 8 years under the management of Al Gore instead of George W. Bush. And it is impossible to exaggerate what a different place Central Asia would be with Afghanistan at its center if Al Gore had been president of the United States in 2001. All right. So it's a high stakes game we're playing in politics. When we make decisions as an isolated individual, we make decisions on the scale of a society of millions. And it's a high stakes game where you place your bet very often based on these quite fine judgments and distinctions, right? Like judgments like what kind of person is Al Gore? And I want to say this up front. The fact that something is impossible doesn't mean it's not worth doing. Not in politics, baby. And we have to think really deeply about the way in which our preconceptions about what's possible and what's impossible shape our short-term decisions and our commitment to long-term plans and outcomes. It's very easy when you're a little child to get frustrated at the piano bench and say, this is impossible. I can't learn to play piano. Little kids react that way to all kinds of challenges. It's impossible. It's impossible. I can't do it. It's impossible. And let's be real here. I mean, I'm jumping ahead a little bit in terms of the topics I want to cover here. I understand the frustration people have with a transition to a vegan diet as an individual. I understand the transition people have, I understand their frustration with a parallel transition to adopting the politics of veganism, the pursuit of a vegan planet, whatever you want to imagine this, the pursuit of a world without slaughterhouses, whatever you want to define the end goal of veganism. I understand, both on the immediate scale, it's impossible to buy a bean burrito in Canada that's not going to give you 12 hours of indigestion. For real, I'm vegan. I sympathize with people who say that they find it impossible to get enough protein. I've lived in different countries all around the world. I know there's this standard thing where vegans just scoff and dismiss complaints about how difficult it is to get enough protein. I neither scoff nor dismiss it. I have a huge tub in the background there of vegan protein supplement. I eat massive amounts of protein every day, but I take it as a protein powder to supplement the rest of my diet. In that childish sense, it's very easy to sort of hit a wall, come to the limit of your own patience, and feel that this is impossible. Sometimes you got to sit down with a little kid and say, in the whole world, how many people have learned to play the piano? How many people this year on planet Earth have learned to play the piano in just 1 year? You can do it. And I know you can. Over 1 million people per year learn to play the piano. It's not everybody. And, if you even think of it as a percentage of the population, like how many people as a percentage of the population are proficient in playing the piano right now? Whether or not you learned it as a child or as adult, who today can sit up and do ragtime on the piano, can sit up and really belt out a piano roll. Okay. I don't know if it's 5%. I don't know if it's 1%. I mean, it's not the majority of people. If you have a democracy, it's not like more than 50% of people have mastered the piano and currently have that skill, right? Okay, but that's very different from a judgment about what's possible and what's impossible. If it's possible for 1%, right, it's possible for you. You can do it. The question is, will you? Right? 100% of people can learn to play the piano, but will you? Are you going to be part of the 1% that actually does it? Right? You can talk about languages this way. Learning Chinese, you think it's impossible? It's hard. Learning Chinese is hard. Okay. How many people learn Chinese every year? Of course you can. Will you? Are you going to be one of the people who does it? Right? How about Cree? How about Ojibwe? How about Dene? How about the language of the Inuit, Inuktitut, whatever you want to call it? You can. Anyone can. Like in principle, there is no language in the world that a child cannot learn. Children can learn these languages. Children can learn to play the piano. It seems so hard, but millions of children can do it, and millions of children do. Of course, you can do it. How hard is it to adopt a vegan diet compared to learning to play the piano? How hard is it to master the discipline of living with a vegan diet, whether you use a box of protein powder like I have in the background there or not, because you don't have to. You can learn how to boil beans properly. There are certain skills. Yeah, Melissa just ate some lima beans and so on. Whatever. You don't have to. But like, let's calibrate first of all this notion of the impossible. If you're saying this is impossible, right? Everything we're talking about in that human individual scale. I know it's hard. Getting along with your parents when you're vegan is hard. Getting along maybe with your boyfriend or girlfriend, getting along with your roommates, getting along in the army. You can have a vegan diet and be there. I get it. Okay. Learning the piano while you're in the army is hard. Learning the piano and not making your roommates angry at you because you're playing the piano all night and keeping them awake or interrupting. They want to read a book and you're playing the piano all the time. You're practicing the piano. That's hard too, right? Learning Chinese it is so much harder to learn the piano. It is so much harder to learn Chinese. It's so much harder to learn an indigenous language on the edge of extinction, whether that's an indigenous language in North America or Myanmar or what have you, an indigenous minority language. That's hard, okay? The life of a vegan as an isolated individual, all right, on this scale, if we're calibrating the claim, it's not impossible, right? And relative to these other things, it's not hard at all. And yet what we deal with all the time in discussing veganism on a large scale or a small scale has everything to do with this conception of the possible and the impossible. And really what we're talking about is the thinkable and the unthinkable. You have to take people hand by hand, hand in hand. You have to hold people by the hand and lead them through a kind of philosophical process of discovery whereby the unthinkable becomes thinkable. Now, on the small scale, I've already kind of described that to you. This is just two people talking. That's what I mean by a small scale, right? The way in which a parent maybe has to sit with a child and say, look, well, your cousin Steve, he thought it was impossible to learn the piano. It was really hard for him at first. And look at him now. Do you remember last Christmas he came over and he played the piano and everyone sang with him? He'd only been studying for 3 years and he could play the piano that well after 3 years. Like, I want you to visualize how easy this is going to be for you once you've got the knack down. I want you to realize what's on the horizon, what's attainable, what can be accomplished with a certain amount of work. And guys, look, I'm not glorifying learning the piano. It may be a complete waste of your time to learn the piano. It's just an example of how something that seems insuperable, impossible to overcome, right? You can talk through with a child the stages they're going to go through. It's going to be hard, and then it's going to become easy in this way, and then this is what it's going to be like to gain proficiency in something. And that child as a child, what do you have to compare it to? What are the processes that they've been through where they've mastered something that seemed impossible, and now they can do it thoughtlessly, effortlessly? They can so easily just glance at sheet music and translate it into a live performance, right? That's the level of proficiency you get to with piano, with this moment-to-moment ability. Learning a language is a lot like that too, in some ways. And, certainly with a language as hard as Chinese, it's useful to talk through with someone realistically. Here's what you should expect over the next 5 years and over the next 10 years, because it's so hard to get up to a real level of proficiency in Chinese. That's such a long struggle. With an easier language like Italian or something, or Spanish, it's probably a very different conversation to have. But, yes, it's ridiculous. Yes, you can learn Spanish. You can learn Cree. You can learn Ojibwe. You can learn Nahuatl, indigenous language in Mexico, et cetera, down south. You can. Now, will you? This becomes totally about whether or not you care enough to do it. But you don't want to think of yourself as an uncaring person. You don't want to think of yourself as an evil person. So instead of posing the problem in terms of your own indolence, in terms of your own lack of feeling, your own lack of passion, if you like, right? Isn't it convenient to instead talk about what's possible and impossible? Everything I've just said, we can repeat with very few alterations when we're talking about the political process of what can be attained politically for veganism and what can be attained politically for ecology what can be attained politically for human health? For me, veganism is not primarily about human health, but it's a factor, folks. Partly, veganism is a challenge, like convincing people to quit smoking cigarettes, like convincing people to quit smoking marijuana, like convincing people to quit alcohol. There is a human quality of life, public health aspect to it. Although for me, this is mostly about ethics, ecology, so on and so forth, and what kind of person you want to be. I realize that this seems impossible to you. It's not impossible. It's unthinkable. And I can take you, holding hands, and we can go through this philosophically, and something unthinkable can become thinkable. You can learn to understand it, in my terms. And again, I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but I think playing the piano is a good example, because you can visualize it so clearly. The level of skill, what people are doing with their hands and what people are doing with their brain, if you sit them down in front of a piece of sheet music they've never seen before, and they've got to do a reading, people say, they just read it, interpret it, and then transform that into music. People get so good at it, they can do it when they're drunk. See people who are blind drunk sit down at a piano and belt out this amazing music. I'm not endorsing either one. I'm not saying you should devote your life to the piano, but like the level of skill you accomplish and then take for granted. Okay, this is so much more difficult and so much more difficult to really visualize than what's involved with veganism, personally or politically, right? And yet that all of us take for granted. The impossible becomes possible. That's what we're dealing with in this video. Oh, guys, I do see your comments as they come in. If you have something intelligent to say, you can make a comment. If you want to hit the thumbs up button, it will help more people join the conversation now, because they'll discover the live stream while it's happening, and it will help people to discover the video later. So I do appreciate it if you take the time to hit thumbs up, frankly, on any of my videos. By the way, if you know anyone who would benefit from this discussion, a lot of you do. A lot of you are vegans. I know who you are watching this video. A lot of you are vegans who are connected to other vegans on Facebook, through Facebook groups. You're vegans who are connected to other vegans on Reddit or what have you. If it's going to be useful to people, share it, share the link. You probably have friends on Instagram who think about and struggle with some of these same issues. Again, I'm about to disclose more explicitly what I'm talking about here. I don't tell you to share the link with people who don't want to hear it. I'm not saying to advertise this to the public. There is a small segment of the public who will really benefit from joining in this conversation, either now or in retrospect, either now or watching the video 5 years from now. And again, guys, I'm not a reckless egomaniac about this, but the discussion we've already had in the last 18 minutes, you will neither find this quality of conversation or this quantity of conversation on any other YouTube channel or any other podcast. Okay. There's nobody else on the internet, in the English language at least, doing it like this. And I doubt there's anyone in Chinese. Okay. So I got a message. It's an Instagram message. And a lot of you will hear things like this all the time. Right? I don't hear it very often because people find me intimidating, which is good. So yeah, you guys can also comment if you've heard this kind of thing from your own friends or relatives. You may have heard it from people within the vegan movement who are now ex-vegan, people who were vegan activists in the past and quit. So I'm just going to quote this verbatim to you. All right. Quote, "As for being vegan, I understand the health benefits. I have been vegetarian and vegan while I worked at Whole Foods all the way through my college years. But the conundrum I constantly ran into was this. Most vegans," so there are some errors here, "most vegans' focus is to refuse the use of animal products. But I met very few who realized how nearly impossible it would be. Do they not eat fruit too because the skin is shined with the shellac of dead insects? Do they build their own houses because the wood caulk used in linoleum uses some parts of horse glue? Do they not drink water out of the sink because in some states, some of the drinking water uses filtration systems with animal bone shards to purify and clean the water?" So I just mentioned that the use of it's bone char is really what he means. That is very rare for water, but for wine, like for red wine, very common. For the production of sugar, very common. For the production of beer they use isinglass. I'm sorry, I'm confusing that there. But definitely wine and sugar, this use of filtration through bone remains is common. Obviously, I'm not saying nowhere on earth uses it for water, but that's a relatively rare example. But anyway, it's in its way, it's a legitimate example. So already, no, sorry, that's not the end of his comment to me. Now, there is a difference between reasoning on a chalkboard and reasoning in the real world. There's a very false kind of fatalism that comes out of examples like the one I just mentioned. I was alive at that time. I was paying attention to politics. So this would have been the election during the year 2000, maybe already in the year 1999. American elections kind of go on forever. So 1999 and 2000, there were all these people saying it was pointless, the decision they were being presented with, whether they should elect George W. Bush or Al Gore. And you can imagine, well, the whole system is corrupt and that there was really no ethical difference between these two men. There's no particular policy that one represents, the other doesn't represent or something, that really things would be more or less the same on planet Earth or more or less the same within the United States of America if they elected Al Gore instead of electing George W. Bush. Okay, so now look, my point is, regarded in isolation, any one of those points, I'll give you a legitimate or legitimate enough reason for saying this. It was true, hilariously, at the time, that the promises being made about campaign finance reform were very similar between George W. Bush and Al Gore. The reason I say it's hilarious is none of those reforms ever happened. So both Al Gore and George W. Bush, they were not offering exactly the same set of reforms, but they were both recognizing that the election system they had was corrupt, that it needed to be improved, and specifically the way money is given to politicians, the way fundraising happens, the way money is collected, that needed to be reformed. And that was debated quite a large percentage of the time that Al Gore spent debating George W. Bush was on campaign finance reform. And this is probably not the only example. You could go through a whole list of policies and prerogatives and priorities where the two men might have seemed similar. They said similar things or made similar promises. So my point is not that this is a totally counterfactual, totally without factual basis to say, you could also do an analysis of the type of education these two men had, or you could list off, they both breathe air and drink water. What are all the things George W. Bush and Al Gore have in common, or the way in which they're indistinguishable from each other as political candidates? And then express your exasperation, your indifference to making the decision between them. Now, if your claim is here, this is several steps further into absurdity, right? Okay. If your claim is both people who eat meat and vegans live in wooden structures, and that wood contains some glue, some adhesive that contains some gelatin from horse hooves. Okay. So you're saying, therefore, there's no important difference between George W. Bush and Al Gore? Therefore, there's no difference between slitting the throat of a cow, to begin with, breeding a cow, raising it in captivity, having it live its whole life on a concrete floor in a metal cage in a shed under a steel sky, right? Having this animal tormented from the day it's born to the day it dies, living this life so utterly different from what it would experience in the wild, in nature, right? Ensuring the perpetual misery of this animal in captivity, and then slitting its throat, cutting into pieces and eating it. So if you have two households, right, one of which is vegan and one of which eats meat 3 meals a day, every day, okay, you think, or you're claiming, or you're asserting that there's no important difference between them. There's no political difference between them, because both of these households have wood that contains glue made from the hooves of a horse. This is the kind of resignationism you're engaged in, right? Now, I've talked about this under many different headings, this kind of misconception about politics. Part of what we're dealing with here is the gap between chalkboard reasoning and real world political reasoning. I have seen, by the way, both Democrat and Republican politicians right now, both members of the Democrat Party and Republican politicians, arguing that there's no ethical difference between the government of Vladimir Putin in Russia and the government in Ukraine. Now, whether they're doing this cynically or sincerely, it really is a parallel sort of thing. They're able to say, for example, they're able to say, well, look at the lack of freedom of the press in Ukraine. Look at the corrupt elections in Ukraine. They're able to point to different forms of political corruption, things that are bad about Ukraine. And then they say, well, so you criticize Vladimir Putin for these things, but you pretend that because Ukraine is our ally, so on and so forth, that therefore they're a morally good, pro-democracy government, what have you. You know, I have never seen anyone audacious enough to present this argument about democracy in Myanmar or democracy in Hong Kong, right? Back when there were elections in Myanmar, they were flawed. Before, they had some democracy. Now, they have none. Some democracy is worth fighting for. Some democracy is worth killing for. Some democracy is worth dying for. And democracy itself is a very good example of this. The way this man who wrote to me is reasoning, and it is stupid, it is shallow, but it's not trivial. This is stupid and shallow, but really important. So I'm taking the time to deal with this. That's why I'm making a video called Vegan Mind Tricks about it. These are the kinds of deceptions and justifications people live with. He is saying, in justifying his own decision to eat meat every day, this is someone who used to be vegan. He claims he was vegan/vegetarian throughout his college years. So we assume that's about 4 years. He got the knack down. He learned how to boil beans or whatever. He learned how to live he learned how to cope with the technical aspects of the diet. You know what I mean? He is saying that he thinks he is morally justified in killing animals, paying other people to kill animals, and eating meat every day because his definition of veganism, written out on a chalkboard, is impossible in the real world. Now, it would be very easy to write a definition of democracy on a chalkboard that does not exist anywhere in the real world today. It is certainly possible to write a definition of democracy on a chalkboard that is impossible for the people of Myanmar, for the people of Cambodia, for the people of Hong Kong, right? Like you could have a definition of democracy that's not completely unattainable on planet Earth, but it's just barely attainable in Switzerland and Denmark. And when you really look at the reality of life in Myanmar, you think, these people can't have democracy by this standard for these reasons. Could get into that, why it would be unattainable in a certain place at a certain time. To give you a proposal, there are many ways to define democracy. Okay, well, one idea of democracy is that everyone should have a say in government. Everyone should be able to participate. Everyone's opinion matters. Everyone is consulted. Everyone gets to vote, for example, in a referendum. And there are no distinctions of rich and poor. That your ability to participate, your ability to have a voice, a vote, to influence the decisions of government is not bought and paid for. It's not because you're an aristocrat. It's not because you're wealthy, right? That this is now this is not the only definition of democracy, but that is one definition of democracy. I think if you did a poll, a very large percentage of people would agree that that's a basic working definition of democracy. Okay, does that exist in the real world anywhere today? How many countries are even attempting to live up to that standard, including countries I have some respect for? Does Japan live up to that standard of democracy? Now again, we have many centuries of reflections and philosophizing about this in the European tradition, especially Italy, frankly. Italy is really underrated for some bizarre reason in political science in the 21st century. It's really underrated and ignored. I mean, I guess it was kind of overrated 1,000 years ago. You could say that, it's gone out of style. But, it is weird how little attention is now paid to any period of Italian history. But, part of the paradox of democracy, already discussed in ancient Greece and in ancient Rome, is that it kind of professes egalitarianism, but it actually entails in practice a kind of elitism, right? Who is influential in the Athenian system of democracy, in the Pnyx? right? People like me. Now, again, you could even say I'm prejudiced in favor of Athenian democracy for that reason. A certain type of daring, well-spoken man who will stand up and risk his life to give voice to his convictions, because you were risking your life to take a political position in ancient Athens. You could also be beaten and flogged and exiled. There were different punishments for, if you took this too lightly, the democratic process. But, it was a certain type of character who had influence in Athens. And there was almost all of the literature we have from ancient Athens is complaining about this as a bad thing. I don't know if we have a single extant document that says it was a good thing. They're constantly complaining about these kind of charismatic figures who would stand up and, in effect, rule Athens just by virtue of their wit and daring. I'm emphasizing daring here for a reason. If you get into more of the literature, if you start reading primary sources, you will see what I mean. And Alcibiades. So hilariously, Alcibiades was not well-spoken. He had a speech impediment. It was most sources, it's something like a lisp, but he actually had a great deal of difficulty speaking, even privately, one-on-one. And when he stood up on stage, he was not a gifted orator or gifted at giving speech, but he was daring. It was a really daring character, and he became one of the foremost, most influential, powerful people in the politics of the greater Greco-Roman world as it then existed. His adventures covered a lot of the map. So daring counted for a great deal. Now, I think it's fair to say there are other political systems where daring is not rewarded, or instead it's a certain kind of dull conformist person who stays quiet and is obedient. That's the kind of person who moves up the ranks, a certain kind of bureaucrat, a certain kind of yes man, So these are differences. But I'm just digressing on this. All right. Even if you have this chalkboard approach to saying, what is democracy? Here's our definition of democracy. Therefore, it's impossible. Therefore, it's unattainable. All right. That doesn't mean it's not worth fighting for. That doesn't mean it's not worth killing for. It doesn't mean it's not worth dying for. Are you kidding me? Now, look, again, I could go on with many, many examples here. And this argument, which people really believe in, again, it's shallow, it's stupid, but it's incredibly important that, the fact that it may be impossible for you to have a 100% vegan diet by this definition, therefore means there's no point in even trying for someone else to even try to have a 99% vegan diet or a 95% vegan diet. People really live with these delusions. But then when you scale it up, that they feel the vegan movement is hopeless, that veganism is a political cause and so on, that's hopeless and pointless and fruitless. It is a bizarre form of reasoning that people really, truly live with. Do you think that a world entirely without slavery is possible? Do you think a world with zero slavery in it is possible? Do you think a world entirely without racism is possible? Do you think we'll ever have a world where people just don't hate each other because of the color of their skin and other ethnic the fact that on a chalkboard, and you can come up with your definition. Again, how exactly you define a world with zero racism or zero slavery? You think there isn't an unbelievable difference between what the United States was in the year 1880 and 1980. Think about those 2 dates. 1880 versus 19. People were still racist in the 1980s. There was kind of the golden age of stand-up comedy on that stuff. There were so many stand-up comedians who get up, and the tension that existed within American society, from the legacy of slavery and racism was tremendous then. I think there was a lot of comedy, a lot of kind of hit Hollywood movies, a lot of rap music were spun to this. Okay, there is no comparison. You think there's no difference between electing George W. Bush and electing Al Gore. God damn, look back at the history of the last century. Whenever you're watching this video, some people may be watching this 10 years from now or 50 years from now, you cannot imagine how the whole world would be a different place today if Al Gore had been president of the United States. Al Gore published books about ecology. Al Gore became vegan. Is he a good vegan? Are they good books about ecology? I think what he has to say about ecology is kind of stupid. Okay, why don't you compare that to what George W. Bush says about ecology? George W. Bush did not write books about ecology. Why do you compare it to the actual policy and so on George Bush had in his hand? The point is, even if you think Al Gore is a second-rate ecologist and a third-rate vegan, even if you have a critical view of him, this difference, this is the way politics works, right? These kinds of real-world differences really matter. They're not just worth voting for. They're not just worth debating about. They're not just worth having this discussion right now on YouTube about. Please hit thumbs up. Please share the link. Please like and subscribe, whatever, I do think this discussion is really important for the people who are going to have it, right? This is actually worth killing people for. This is what civil wars get fought over, okay? The French Revolution, very briefly, for a few years, destroyed the power of the Catholic Church in France, all right? Did they accomplish 100% atheism? Did they replace a society that was intensely religious? I mean, France, immediately before the French Revolution, was just as religious as Italy or whatever you want to say. They broke the power of the church. Yes, with violence. Are you shocked to learn that the Catholic Church was not going to give up its ownership of land worth the equivalent of billions of dollars today? Incredibly valuable land, incredibly valuable states. The Catholic Church was not just going to give up political power and economic power, let alone, religious power in whatever nebulous sense. The Catholic Church was not just going to embrace this new era of enlightenment. People defending the Catholic Church were willing to fight and die for what they believed in. Well, the people who believed in an atheist society were willing to fight and die also, and one side killed more people than the other. All right? And guys, I have no illusions about the brutality and violence of the French Revolution. There was also money involved, okay? They would go to a property and they would declare. So there's both a carrot and a stick here. There's some bait on the hook as well as the immediate threat of violence. And they'd say to these monks, so you'd have an estate, a stereotypical estate in France at this time. There were monks who are making wine, or they might be making brandy or some other hard liquor. There's monks who run a distillery, and they have a farm, and the guys are all wearing the robes and living in celibacy, or what have you. And the French Revolution show up and say, hey, look, here's the deal. The Dark Ages are over. We are going to literally force you to get married. You have to stop living in celibacy. You have to get a wife. And we're going to do a bunch of things to help you transition into a better life in modern society. And for some of those monks, you got to admit, whether it's 10% of the guys or 50%, some of the monks, like, this doesn't sound so bad. You're going to have a new life in the new society. And guess what? We're taking away this land and we're dividing it into parcels and we're basically auctioning off. I believe it was mostly rental contracts. It wasn't permanent sale. But the government raised a lot of money by selling or renting or leasing farmland that they took away from the church. So again, you can see there's an element of greed, there's an element of looting. And now some percentage of the monks respond to this by saying they were going to go get a sword and a gun and go fight for Jesus, fight to prolong the Dark Ages. Right? Not surprising. Some percentage of them joined royalist groups and ultra-Catholic groups. One of them was called the Sons of Jehu, as I recall. And that's been misremembered as the Sons of Jesu, but it wasn't. It was Sons of Jehu and obscure. There were ultra-Catholic and pro-monarchist terrorist groups who fought to go back to the Dark Ages and so on. And again, there were bad intentions on all sides. Okay, if you are going to sit there, let's say you're alive at that time, you're going to cross your arms and say, well, we can never have a 100% atheist society. We can never have a society in which nobody worships anything, in which nobody believes in anything. You don't think there's a difference between having a society in which all education is provided by nuns and a society in which none of it is? This was a serious issue at that time in France, was how do you provide sexual education? They had no ability to deal with sexually transmitted diseases, STDs. They had no ability to deal with this medically. The main way to prevent sexually transmitted diseases was education. Right? You relied on, they didn't have condoms, or the condoms they had were not effective in this way. I mean, your ability to cope with this, venereal disease, I'm going to say, right? It really relied on your ability to deal with unwanted pregnancy. Like, you had to deal with this. And one of the huge stumbling blocks was, well, guess what? The only people providing education are nuns. And most of them either don't know anything about sex, or they're uncomfortable talking about sex, or both, or they're part of this insane, part of this insane cult that has very sex negative attitudes. Great suggestion from William McGeehan in the audience. William writes, quote, "The monks were happily MGTOW and making great..." Some percentage of the monks were alcoholics living in celibacy. That's true. But I think you can imagine some of the monks thought, hey, this is an opportunity. Some of them didn't want to be there. Some of them were from a poor family that had too many sons and were told, look, you got to go join the monastery because we have no better career in life for you, or whatever their situation was. Sure, some of them would have embraced the opportunity and to get married and have a more normal life. And some of them were willing to fight and die for the future of an illusion, for the future of this idea of Christendom left over from the Dark Ages to perpetuate that forever. Okay, an atheist society was worth fighting for then, and it's worth fighting for now. Let's cast our minds back to the year 2001. It's a lifetime ago, a lifetime cut tragically short, a lifetime ago, 2001. An atheist society in Afghanistan, a truly secular society. Is it possible or impossible? I think it's still a tall order to talk about an atheist society in Vermont, to talk about an atheist society in Denmark. Still today in France. France is still a deeply religious country. How about Italy right now in 2022? Still, Catholic Church has too much power. The pursuit of an atheist society, if you could transform Afghanistan so that it goes from its current level of religiosity to being as atheist as Italy is today, that would be an amazing accomplishment, right? Relative differences of degree matter even more than differences of kind. In politics, we're never talking about 100% or 0%. Racism is never going to be 0%. Tooth decay is never going to be 0%, right? Poverty is never going to be 0%, all right? When the United States made it illegal for a property developer, for a landlord of any kind, to distinguish between black and white applicants for owning a home, renting an apartment, that really mattered. Okay, were people still racist? Yes. Do segregated neighborhoods still exist in the United States of America? Yes. I mean, you can just look at a map of the state of Georgia or Atlanta or something. You can say, oh yeah, white people live here and black people live here. Okay, but formerly, in the recent past in America, there were legally overt forms of racism that involved the banks and property developers and landlords, and very literal ghettoization, where black people didn't have the option to live in this neighborhood versus that neighborhood. Now, if you have a society where everyone's free to live wherever they want to, but people are still racist and live in separate neighborhoods, it's still a problem. It's a different problem, right? So, yeah, look, I'm doing this because each and every one of you is going to have somebody you love in your life, somebody you care about enough to hold their hand and talk through this series of philosophical and political realizations, right? I mean, I've always detested, I made videos about this about 5 years ago. I've always detested this habit of mind encouraged by other YouTubers of just saying, that's a logical fallacy, and then shutting down and dismissing the other person. That's an appeal to futility fallacy. That's a trolley car fallacy. That's this. They memorize these thought-terminating cliches. All right. No, deal with the fallacy. That's also part of politics. We have to really deal with fallacious reasoning. People in Afghanistan are all cutting off part of their penis so they can go to heaven after they die. Okay, we have to deal with. There's no point. You're not going to win anything by just saying that's fallacious or something. You have to really wade into human nature. You have to get dirty. You have to think the way they think. You have to use sympathy as an analytical tool. You have to understand why they see it this way. You have to reason things through their way and then hold their hand and help them reason their way out of it. And guys, I don't recommend doing it all the time. I just said at the beginning of this statement, I said, some of you, I think all of you, there's somebody you love. There's somebody you care about enough to do what I'm doing in this video now, to really break it down and talk it through with them. And there's an infinite number of people. There are more than 6 billion people where you don't care enough to do that. And you just have to look at them and say, yup, you don't get it. You're never going to get it. And it's not my job to, lower myself to your level to reason it through with you in your way, right? The appeal to nature fallacy is real. It's a dominant mode of thinking in our time. The appeal to futility fallacy is real. It's a dominant mode of thinking in our time. The belief that Jesus Christ was a superpowered zombie who came back from the dead. Who even can speak of this in terms of a fallacy? It's just ludicrous. It's just ridiculous. I mean, there's so many claims built into the New Testament that are just wildly historically improbable. Within Patreon, I drew attention to this recently. There's a passage that refers to Jewish pig farmers having thousands of pigs on the banks of the Sea of Galilee. All right, and the geography makes no sense. It's very obvious that whoever wrote that passage of the New Testament was not really familiar with, did not understand the geography of Israel. Jewish pig farmers. Did Jewish people in that period of time farm pigs on the Sea of Galilee? And you can go through the archaeological record. By the way, that's in archaeology, that's very well preserved. Like if you have cattle farms, you can have 2,000 years of bone fragments from all the cows that lived, cows that were slaughtered there and cows that were farmed there. That's true all over Europe. Any inhabited part of the world, you can tell what people were farming. Do you think there were thousands of pigs being farmed by Jews in the Sea of Galilee? Why do you think the text was written this way? There were all these unbelievably obvious hints at what the New Testament really is. All right. Like this is way beyond a logical fallacy. All right. This is the wildly irrational, passionate reality of what human reasoning is. And if you love someone, if you care about someone as a unique human being, you are going to hold their hand and walk through the fire with them. You're going to actually go through this shit with them because of the possibility that they can be freed, that they can think their way out of, the wildly irrational beliefs they've thought their way into and that they're now committed to justifying and making excuses. Okay. Now look, sorry, the particular guy writing into me, I'll read you more of what he says in my response to it. Okay, a good question from Frida. I'll respond to that in 1 second. If any of you have anything intelligent to say, right in. If you have nothing intelligent to say, it's okay. It's up to you to judge. Decide if you have something intelligent enough for me to interrupt what I'm saying or respond to it that way. Okay. Look, I do not know why this guy became vegan during his university years, right? But I'm going to say this: he probably had good reasons. Right. Like, I don't think if he was vegan for 4 years, I don't think it's for no reason. All right. He said he had a job at Whole Foods, and during those years, he was vegan, whether his reasons were ethical, environmental. All right. And yet, this unbelievably trivial excuse he's giving now is a good enough reason for him to eat meat, right? For him to kill and eat the bodies of animals every day. Again, relying on the idea of the possible and the impossible, the thinkable and the unthinkable, right? Now, okay, we can sit here and harshly condemn his character, and by all means, go right ahead. You may be in that situation with your boss at work. There may just be people in your life. You may know ex-vegans, and so many they have I had acne. Like they stopped being vegan because they had acne. as if nobody who eats meat gets acne. It's just ridiculous. But that's who they are. Like if you knew someone who literally owned slaves and who offered you the excuse that a world with zero slavery is unattainable, and a 100% emancipated world is unattainable. Therefore, they're just going to go on owning and exploiting slaves. They're going to literally have people in chains and whip them every day. Pardon me, on that excuse, that chalkboard excuse. This doesn't tell me anything about slavery. It doesn't tell me anything about politics. It tells me something about you, right? It tells me something about this person. And you can never dismiss that. You just mentioned, maybe you guys encounter this attitude, maybe you don't. But I think one of the most potent and influential forms of stupidity in our time is the attempt to disassociate politics from the unique individual and to instead think in terms of systems, abstractions on a chalkboard, but also social systems on a grand scale. I see so much pessimism about transforming individual people tied to a reckless revolutionary optimism about changing the system, right? There are reasons for that I think are ultimately rooted in our system of education. It's how people are taught in school, maybe to some extent also how they're taught in religion. People say again and again that you can't transform individual people, but you can change the system, okay? And they're wrong, right? The system consists of people. It consists of relationships between people. It consists of rules and traditions that are transferred between people. The Constitution of the United States of America is like a napkin at a bar. You were supposed to meet your friend there. You sat down to have a drink. And there's an empty glass of beer with a note written down on it from your friend saying he had to go away for 5 minutes. And then you sit there and find out your friend just died in a traffic accident and is not coming back. Okay? A constitution, a written law, is nothing more than a jotted down note communicating something from one human being to another. It's a thought, it's a sentiment, it's a tradition. All right? Yes. And you don't get to talk back to that person. You don't get to change their mind. You just get to choose whether you're going to take this napkin, the last thing ever written down by your friend. They're going to meet you at the bar, and whether you're going to worship it, you're going to fetishize it. You can put it in a frame and hang it on your wall and make a big deal of it, carry it around forever, or if you're going to crumple it up and throw it away and start with a new napkin. Okay. Melissa and I both read recently a court decision that was frankly a brilliant court decision in the United States. It was just highly intelligent, highly inventive. I think I read it out loud to you. Like, I read it, and the most interesting parts I read out loud to Melissa. And it was the high court decision in the United States about Pac-Man, the video game. And this judge was trying to interpret legal precedent about theater, about the performance of a play in the theater, and applying it to what was then the brand new technology of video games. So he was looking at legal precedents and decisions by courts before where one playwright sues another playwright saying, hey, you ripped off my story. Like, they came up with a detective story. Let's just say it's a detective story where it turns out the butler did it. Like, that's the plot twist, And they say, well, you didn't give me any money. You didn't pay me. You wrote your own script. And even though it's different in some ways, it's fundamentally my plot that you ripped off my idea for the story. He had to interpret court precedents about the theater and apply them to Pac-Man, the video game, and decide the limits. At what point is a video game so similar to Pac-Man that you can win a court case on the basis of that similarity, right? And it was brilliant. It was highly erudite, highly intelligent, like well-intentioned courtesy. Like I enjoyed it. I was really impressed. It was not stupid. It was not trivial. All right. But that's what the law is. That's the system. Like the system you're talking about. They are just decisions made by particular people at one point in time to cope with one short-term crisis after another. The Constitution of the United States of America was a set of decisions completely intended to solve a short-term crisis. The single most outstanding crisis was a currency crisis, by the way. I've written a whole book about it, but if you understand what was really going on and what they were trying to solve, why doesn't it say one word about policing or police brutality? The American Constitution, why doesn't it say one word about marriage? Why doesn't it say one word about privacy? Why doesn't it say anything about abortion? Why doesn't it say anything about relations between black people and white people, which, later a civil war was fought over? There are all these issues of obvious, overwhelming importance. Why doesn't it define or discuss what it means by property, or liberty or anything else? There are these huge gaps in what, in a very basic sense, a constitution ought to do or needs to do. Why does it say so little about the relationship between religion and government? It does say something. It doesn't say nothing at all, but it's sort of judicious in its silence. Why does it say so little even about the relationship between the federal government and the states, the 13 colonies, as they then were? And then judges and legislators, members of Congress and so on, they're left to piece together these little scraps of information, these little napkins left behind at the bar from our great deceased ancestors, and try to make a coherent picture and apply it to the problems of today. The authors of the Constitution, did they ever consider the ethics of extraordinary rendition, of arresting a teenager in Afghanistan on the suspicion that they're somehow connected to terrorism, transporting them to Germany, and then keeping them in a prison in Cuba, in Guantanamo Bay, for years, possibly for decades? You want to have a court case where you sit there with these little napkins, these little notes, these decisions made about irrelevant things. And some of those decisions are stupid, and some of them are evil. Like some of them are really, take a look at high court precedents on slavery in the United States of America. Many of the judges, as individual people, were unspeakably evil people. I really mean that. They're not all like that Pac-Man decision. They're not all erudite people you can kind of appreciate. How about genocide against the indigenous people and the decisions about that? You get into some real evil just in the court precedents and how these things are interpreted and applied. Oh, another one is eugenics. Eugenics in the United States of America. That'll give you nightmares reading those. Really, it'll give you nightmares, those court precedents, So, and frankly, eugenics in Europe goes back to Plato in ancient Greece. In ancient Greece, there's a lot of discussion. Ancient Greece and Sparta, they could have dealt with eugenics in writing the American Constitution. It wasn't a new idea, and then the role of government and the parents and the children could have dealt with all these things, none of it's there. But you're talking about people interpreting these utterly irrelevant scraps of information, decisions, and even when they're brilliant, they're spurious, and often enough they're stupid or evil or a combination of the two. All right. I just can't believe that I'm a member of a generation that believes that it's easier to change the system than it is to change individual people. People can change. Once you change enough people, they will change the system. Transforming people individually in hundreds or in thousands, that is what's possible. That's the change we can make here and now. All right. Systemic change in the absence of violence on an unspeakable scale. No offense, but for people in the audience today, for you, it is probably an unimaginable scale. In the absence of violence and coercion of a nature you can't even imagine, right? Changing the system is utterly impossible compared to changing individual people, dozens of people, hundreds of people, thousands of people. I could use tons of examples here, but one of them is Afghanistan. Okay. You want to write a new constitution for Afghanistan? It could be the same as the one from the French Revolution. Declare the rights of man, declare that you have a secular society, whatever you want. Okay, you've got to change people. And it may start with a dozen, it may start with 100, it may start with 1,000, right? Like, obviously, in a case like Afghanistan, you have this extreme challenge in the transition to a secular society. Even if you just take, the laws that France has today, you could just translate the entire legal code of France and then impose it on Afghanistan. The American army could have done that. What do you think the results would be? This is a problem for France too. They would continue to have a Taliban country, right, where Taliban values and Taliban religious ideas were simply being exercised in a French-style court of law with French-style police, so on and so forth, guarding it. No, people, the human element is what you can change, right? You change the people, and then people change the system. Now, again, with the significant caveat that if you want systemic change without changing the people first, that involves violence. I've already described to you here the violence of the French Revolution in some detail with some particular example of the type of violence involved. Okay, all right. If you wanted to immediately and overnight eliminate circumcision in Afghanistan so that no more boys and no more girls were being circumcised after the birth, imagine the type of violence. Imagine the coercion, just for that one issue, that one aspect of the Muslim faith. Right, to enforce that and do it immediately, not over decades or centuries of cultural transformation and personal transformation. Okay, you can do it, but like I'm really saying to you, I've studied some incredibly dark chapters of history. I haven't been involved in that kind of violence myself, but I can imagine the type of violence we're talking about here. If you do the reading or you get out and have that kind of experience, you may start to imagine it also. All right, but coercive cultural transformation, changing the system first and not individual people, that's what you're talking about, right? And look, I've written a whole book about this. The other question we have to get into profoundly is the extent to which that transformation will always be phony, will always be pointless, will always be counterproductive if it is merely coerced, right? Now, religion is easier to visualize this with than veganism, but you have to do both for the purpose of this video. All right. If you convert someone to Islam through brute force, through the sword, and they are only as Muslim as they have to be as a result of that coercion, right? You have a thoroughly phony, nominal convert to Islam who doesn't believe in the religion, who doesn't respect the Quran, doesn't pray, or only prays in a public forum where he's forced to go through the motions due to this kind of coercion, right? And that exists. It exists today historically when Islam was an empire rapidly expanding. A huge percentage of people had just been conquered by a Muslim army. They'd understand, okay, just to survive, they have to convert minimally and nominally, right? Well, you can have the same with atheism, right? You can have a society where people are nominally atheist, where, for example, a communist dictatorship is forcing them to pretend to be atheist, right? I know this is going to sound absurd to you guys, but that happened with communists in China forcing people to eat meat. There were many people in China who were vegetarian. It's a traditional aspect of many religions in China, frankly. It's not especially Buddhist. Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, in general, all the Chinese folklore traditions regarded vegetarianism positively. And this may sound ridiculous to you, but Chinese communism, with tremendous violence, tried to force people to be secular, force people to be atheist, and that included forcing people who had been vegetarian to eat meat, And I think you can imagine, like, you might be someone is insincerely compelled to be vegan, and they're just barely as vegan as possible. And it's an historical reality that people were forced to eat meat, and they were maybe only eating as much meat as possible. So again, I've written a whole book about this, and it's only 100 pages long. So I have 2 books coming out. My other book is longer and deeper, and I think more emotionally exhausting. I find my books emotionally exhausting. Other people find them entertaining and uplifting, which is a good sign. I get a lot of positive feedback. But anyway, I find this stuff somewhat emotionally exhausting to deal with. Maybe that's why I write the books and don't read them. But other people seem to find it positively motivating. But I have one book called Veganism: Future of an Illusion, only 100 pages, and then this much longer book, No More Manifestos. They both deal with this. But I'm just saying, on the level of one-to-one relationships, just you and one person you love in your life, one person you respect, one person you care about, and on the larger scale of a society of millions. I mean, okay, let's bring this all the way down. Let's make this really tangible and easy to imagine. I'm ethnically Jewish. In case you hadn't guessed, I'm an atheist. I'm a nihilistic atheist. I have met some Orthodox Jewish women who were very attractive. I have. And some of those women found me very attractive. What if I had been seduced by one of these women and she says to me that she wants to proceed with a relationship, she wants to get married, but I'm going to have to be Jewish enough to make the marriage work. I'm going to have to be Jewish enough to get along with her parents and grandparents, let's say aunts and uncles, to participate in certain ceremonies, maybe to memorize and recite certain phrases in Hebrew. Like she knows genetically I have enough Jewish ancestry to make it work, but I'm going to have to adopt the religion. Conversely, what if one of these women falls in love with me and I say, look, you're going to have to be atheist enough. You're going to have to be nihilist enough to suit me. You're going to have to be vegan enough to suit me, right? And maybe it's both, right? Maybe you have a marriage where it's not as simple as saying one party imposes his will on the other, or one woman imposes her will on the man. Maybe each of us is influencing the other in a complex tug of war, right? Maybe you get into a marriage where simultaneously you are forcing the person to have secular, atheist, nihilistic attitudes. And maybe you're forcing them to be vegan, but maybe reciprocally, they're forcing you to participate in religious ceremonies or something, right? Okay. Now, I've said about a lot of things, but I see your comments coming in. That's great. If you want to comment more, please do. If a couple more people hit the thumbs up button, that'll be great. Have as many thumbs up as we have people in the audience. Okay. I've said in this video repeatedly that having an atheist world is worth fighting for and worth dying for. It was worth it during the French Revolution, still worth it today. I've said about many things like, look, a world without slavery is worth fighting for and worth dying for. And don't tell me it's impossible. See, it's kind of irrelevant to say you can never have a 100% emancipated world. You can never have a world with zero slavery. You can never have a world with zero religion. You can never have a world that's 100% enlightened or 100% rational. Well, guess what? 50%, just 50% democracy is worth fighting for and worth dying for. We were looking up the ratings yesterday or the day before yesterday. There's this website that ranks how democratic different countries are. And it's a bit ridiculous, but some of them, when you're at the low end, the difference between 9% democracy and 18% democracy, that's worth fighting and dying for. The difference between 18% democracy and 50% democracy, you're looking at real world examples. Obviously, you can calibrate this or measure this in different ways. The assignation of numbers is a bit arbitrary. But nevertheless, guys, the difference between living in Thailand and living in Saudi Arabia is worth fighting for, worth dying for. Okay, so you've heard me say that. But, all right, is it worth fighting for someone to be an atheist if it's going to be utterly phony and coercive, right? Like if I know my own wife, like she's just in love with me and she's pretending to be atheist and pretending to be secular, just to be atheist enough to make this marriage work, right? Vice versa. She loves me. Let's say I married someone who's an Orthodox Jew, and she knows in my heart I'm an atheist, and I'm just going through the motions. I'm just doing these ceremonies to satisfy her and her parents and grandparents. I'm just Jewish enough. I'm just tolerating this. Maybe because she's really beautiful. Maybe because the sex is really good. Something really shallow like this. Hey, let's add, maybe she's rich. Let's say she's paying my rent. There you go. Let's add some more variables to the matter. Maybe I'm financially dependent on her. There you go. Now you've got a real tug of war, right? And you got something to start. Okay. So it's one thing to say this is worth fighting for, this is worth arguing for, this is worth having this live stream discussion for, when it's something sincere and real, right? What about when it's utterly phony? What about when it's insincere? What about when it's coercive in nature? And we all have to deal with that, right? Some of us adopt beliefs and things just because of our work or place of employment. I remember talking to one guy who had become a professor at a Christian university in Japan. And I talked with him. And I said, "Oh, wow, okay, I'm surprised you did that." And I was asking him, I said, "Well, look, I assume it's only as Christian as the Boy Scouts or something, like it's not too Christian." And I appreciate he took the time to write back to me and really describe how his life was made horrible every day because he was a professor at a university. He was an atheist, and they held prayer meetings every day. And they drew, stuff. They were supposed to hold hands and stand in a circle and close their eyes and pray. And they prayed for their students. There was all this religious content built into what was going on at the university, And I'm going to say, in a subtle way, it was horrifying and coercive for him to deal with every day. And anyway, in ways you may or may not have examined, all of us are subject to coercion in these ways. Okay. So guys, Melissa, if you want to say something, Melissa is also here and is a member of the audience. I'm now going to take a minute to respond to what's in the audience. You don't think I've left anything unsaid? Yeah, this is a bit of a paint roller approach to this issue, covering all the corners of the issue. Okay, so comment. I understand. I understand your concern or objection here. So, random dude in the audience is defending the importance of the American Constitution. So, random dude, you may really enjoy reading both of my books, both Future of an Illusion and No More Manifestos. No More Manifestos deals with this much more directly and explicitly. Okay, now I have to ask you, to what extent you attribute the positive aspects of American culture, the positive aspects of America politically, to this piece of paper, as opposed to attributing it to people themselves. There is certainly a religion in the United States of America that proceeds from the assumption that people are bad, that human nature is bad, and everything good about the United States of America is thanks to this written constitution, a written law, constraining and holding back the evils of human nature. So this is human nature being like a lion on a choke chain, a lion that has a chain going around its neck. And without this constitution, the people of the United States of America would just be unspeakably barbaric or evil or terrible. Now, that theory is so obviously flagrantly wrong that nobody really says it out loud. But again, I'm not saying this to ridicule you, but this is an implicit part of your own argument of what you've said to me here. You seem to think the American people are terrible people. And I'm at the opposite extreme on that. I think what's right with the United States of America is because of its people. It's because of its culture and so on, and people just as individual people. It's the product of a certain historical process created this culture. I do not think that the American people are bad, but their constitution is good. My argument is very much the opposite, that America is good despite its constitution and not because of it. Now, correctly understood, again, you can read my books and you might enjoy it more than you think you do. What I'm saying is profoundly flattering about Americans. Really, you should be flattered. I'm saying there are really good things about America. But what's good about you is not your court system. It's not your police system. It's not your corpus of written law. That's not what's good about America. And if you really just stop and reflect on it, do you feel proud of your court system? Do you feel proud of your system of lawyers? How do you feel about lawyers? How do you feel about the people who charge such high fees, who make so much money, and who bankrupt people by taking your constitution and putting it into practice? How do you feel about the legal system? And many people will respond to this. I don't know if this was saying, no. Somehow the Constitution is this morally perfect thing that exists above, it hovers above the reality of the legal system and practice. No, it's not. It's one cog. It's one wheel. It's one part of the, mechanism of this wind-up toy of, the American legal system. No, the Constitution, this is ridiculous. What's wrong with policing in America? What's wrong with courts? What's wrong with the legal system is what's wrong with the Constitution, and vice versa. The Constitution is a linchpin aspect of a terrible legal system that most Americans are ashamed of. Now, look, I'll just say, so in many ways, I'm really profoundly pro-American. I think viewers of my channel actually are somewhat astonished at that. I can give you a really quick contrast, and it's going to be easier for you to visualize this because you're not connected. I'm sorry, but it's obvious this person is American and they're some kind of American nationalist. What is good about Thailand? Do you respect the Constitution of Thailand? Do you respect the legal system, the courts, the police? Is that what's good about Thailand? Or is it that what's good about Thailand is really good despite the legal system, despite their political problems, frankly? And that's a country that has rewritten its constitution quite recently. If you respect Thailand as it exists today, you respect the Thai people. That's really what your respect is for. And you see the goodness of the Thai people shining through despite their legal system. That's how I feel about America. And just another one that's a little bit less exotic, but again, you'll have detachment about it. What's good about France? Have you ever read the Constitution of France? Again, I encourage you, read the Constitution of Thailand. Read the Constitution of France. Read the Constitution of Brazil. Read the Constitution of Russia today, Vladimir Putin's Russia. Read the Constitution. There's a big gap between what the Constitution says and the reality of life in Vladimir Putin's Russia. Read the Constitution of Communist China. It'll blow your mind. The Constitution of Communist China says they have elections all the time. They have no elections. There can be a big gap between what the Constitution is on paper. Reality. Okay, what is good about France? Now, I could list off all the things I like about France. There are things I really positively appreciate about France. The French are ashamed of their court system. They're ashamed of their lawyers, as are Americans. They feel they have a terrible court system, terrible lawyers, and it really was exposed during the Gilets jaunes period and the George Floyd period. They're also ashamed of their police. They have tremendous problems with police brutality. It's somewhat different than America's situation. You want to speak? But I just say that's a very fundamental different thing. And, I know you've stumbled into this. It's something my own thoughts are very much gathered on because I've written 2 different books that deal with it, especially No More Manifestos deals with this great depth and great passion. Yeah. Sure. She's wearing the T-shirt. You can buy the T-shirt yourselves. Yes. Yeah. Go on. Yeah.
So my question concerns this issue of coercion versus, genuinely doing something because you've thought it through and decided that this is the right thing to do. So I know.
So go on. Yeah.
Okay. I know of a certain little girl who didn't want to brush her teeth.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think many people can relate to this on a family scale. Maybe you can even remember yourself when you didn't want to brush your hair, when you didn't want to brush your teeth. Yeah. And, your parent had to coerce you to do that because they knew better. They knew that if you didn't brush your teeth, then you might get cavities. And, tooth decay is a real problem. So on this scale, I think we can all recognize that there is just a certain time and level of understanding that people have to go through before they can really understand why you're doing what you're doing. Why are you forcing them to do something that they don't want to do? So
I want to jump in. I'm sure you have more. Okay, but look, I want to answer this immediately. So when I was much younger, when I was like 21 or something, I was an optimist about human nature because I thought, okay, when we start off, we're all stupid teenagers. But sooner or later, when life gets on, like once we're all in our 40s or 50s, we've all, like some of us sooner than others, we've all attained a certain level of intellectual sophistication, political sophistication, philosophical sophistication, ethical sophistication. Because, I was aware when I was a teenager and when I was, say, 21 years old, I was aware that there was this gap between myself and basically everyone else my own age. I can just pause. being real with you, it wasn't almost everyone else. It was every other person I'd ever met who was my own age was far less intellectually sophisticated than I was. That's luck, partly, right? Like I'm not saying I was the most brilliant person in the world, but let me tell you, I mean, I was enrolled in political science at the University of Toronto, most of my professors, most of them who were much older than me, they were way less intellectually sophisticated than I was and knew less about politics, knew less about philosophy. I dealt with that a lot. It was horrifying to me. I didn't feel happy about it. Wasn't on an ego trip. It was totally bewildering to me. But my optimism at that time was, okay, I look around at these other people who are 18, 19, 20, 21, and think, okay, there's a gap between us today. I'm more advanced than you. But sooner or later, you're going to catch up with me. And then we're all going to be, let's say, 50 years old. And we're all going to be sophisticated and ready to take on, the difficult questions of our time. That was my hope. Not that the number 50 wasn't my, but I really felt that I was equal to these people and that we would become more equal with time. All right. The tragedy of my middle-aged life is really accepting that no, we were unequal then, and we have become more and more unequal over time. Like when I was 21, I was more advanced because I had 5 years thinking and worrying about politics, philosophy, ethics, and all kinds of other substantive things. Worrying about art. Worrying about, how to be a writer, how to be an artist, how to be a playwright, how to be a comedian. There were other things I'd put my mind into. But anyway, just in general, we can just say politics, intellectual development, ethical development, emotional development. So there was this inequality when I was 21. But rather than that inequality shrinking with time, everyone catching up and becoming more equal, right? What I've seen instead is people becoming more and more unequal over time. That the gap, when we only have 5 years of adulthood behind us, there's a certain gap. And now we have 10 years. Now we have 15 years. Now we have 20 years. And the gap is becoming wider and wider, right? I know this is a small example, but it's a very telling one. I only had a certain amount of free time when I was taking care of my newborn daughter. She was a baby, and I literally spent a lot of time rocking just that action. Really, you spend a lot of time doing it. But you would have bits and pieces of free time. Every so often, the baby takes a nap. Sometimes totally unexpectedly, by the way. So all of a sudden, the baby's asleep, and maybe you have 15 minutes, maybe you have half an hour to read something. Now, I knew other fathers, like you met other guys, what it is, you're going to the hospitals, whatever context, you meet other parents with kids the same age when you're a parent generally, and, I also talked to guys who had been parents in the past, their kids were now grown up. There are other guys who, when they get those 15 minutes, they're running over to the TV to press play and watch the football game, watch the baseball game. Like that's what they're doing with their time. And again, it was very memorable to me that what I was doing, I was reading Thucydides, I was reading Herodotus, I was reading the ancient Greek works on politics and political philosophy. And I was still asking myself hard questions that stereotypically people associate with your teenage years, right? Okay, this is a long answer to your question, but this is from me answering your question. All right. The problem with this mode of thinking, I totally get it. It's the puzzle of I know better than you. Therefore, I have to ask you to brush your teeth.
Right.
Even if you don't understand why you have to brush teeth, because I know what's best and you don't. Okay. The problem is when you let yourself get into this way of thinking in politics. All right. I look at Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. I know most people regard her as a brilliant person. And I see someone who's so stupid and so ignorant that they shouldn't even have the right to vote. Like my gap with AOC, sure, if you let yourself think this way, where it's like, I get to decide who brushes their teeth, who does and doesn't have the right to brush teeth. Right. But this is my point is politically, I totally understand both sides of it. Politically, you can take rights away from some people, or even the vast majority of people, and say, look, you're not at a level of education, sophistication enough to make this decision. We have to make this decision for you, right?
Okay. So
as soon as you do, though,
it has been shown if you brush your teeth,
Yes,
It leads to
Right.
fewer cavities. That this is an important, healthy thing to do. So it's very obvious that I am doing the right thing when I am basically forcing Isel's daughter to brush his teeth, right?
Her teeth. You said his teeth.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Yes, forcing Isel's daughter to brush her teeth.
Right.
And I can hold her hand because I love her. I'm not doing it in a mean way, you know, saying, look, I'm brushing my teeth. Let's brush our teeth together. I even brushed her teeth for her.
Yes,
example,
right.
You know, so I'm just saying, like, that is very clear. That is very obvious. But for other people, it is not obvious that veganism is the right thing to do, obviously, because it's only such a small percentage of the population. So in effect, you're saying,
okay. So I totally disagree with you. And this is the problem. Sorry, I'm just saying, guys, again, this is something, it's shallow, but it's really important. So we just went through this globally, in the United States of America, but globally. Okay. The people who refused to use vaccines in the last 2 years, and that phenomenon has gone on for decades. Like already 20 years ago, 40 years ago, there were people who were super morally opposed to vaccines. Were they predominantly young? Were they predominantly teenagers? Like what I saw a lot of middle-aged people, a lot of elderly people. Were they, predominantly? No, but my point is, it's very easy to say that it's scientifically self-evident that you should brush your teeth.
yes,
That it's a fact.
But I recognize there are still adults who don't.
Right. No, and they're committed. There are people who believe fluoride is they have
conspiracy.
Right. Yeah, they do.
Yeah.
There are people, I mean, with the vaccine thing, it played out in dramatic fashion. People committed to this. And some of them are highly educated. I've seen people with PhDs. I've seen some of them are highly educated. A lot of them are elderly or middle-aged. They're not just teenagers. They're not just ignorant. But like, this is my point. To me, this is the same as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Like, to me, she's still a baby. She's still a little kid mentally, AOC, where someone like me can decide you got to brush your teeth. And her opinion doesn't matter. Like, that's how I feel about it. But like politically, what you're committing to with democracy is precisely the openness to let those people come into the Pnex, let those people come into the parliament, let them have a voice, no matter how stupid and misinformed, no matter how anti-scientific or genuinely crazy. That's the gambit you're taking in politics, in democracy. Yeah. And I would just say, part of the tragedy of non-democratic systems of government, people might think that they're avoiding that, but it's just as terrifying with aristocracy or openly elitist that you end up with the same problem. So go on. I know I'm not driving at the same point as you, but that's why I think it's so important to say, well, this is the necessary implication of that, right? Go on.
I mean, maybe it's a totally different point, but I do also have an awareness of just how much was discussed in ancient Athens now, and realizing that many of these issues were already discussed.
Yes.
Including
even vegetarianism.
Yes. Makes it even more upsetting to think that we're still at this stage. And, when you talk about living in a place like Afghanistan, at what point will they be ready to see the light that circumcision is wrong?
Right. I know.
At what point is it just going to be that we don't need to force them to do this?
Right.
They will just see that this is inherently the right thing to do, is to stop circumcising infants. Like this is.
Right, and but at the current level of education in the United States and England, we could include many countries in Europe. A huge percentage of people get circumcised in both the United States of America and England. I believe Australia too. I don't know. We could look it up. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe Australia's lower. But my point is, you can't say that if the level of education in Afghanistan were raised to be equal to the United States and England, that the problem would disappear. Right. Because circumcision as a problem is still dominant in the United States and England. That's correct. Yes. Yeah. And I mean, I'm very explicit. The book philosophizes about this at some length. Democracy involves coercion. Democracy absolutely involves, you have a meeting, you have a vote, you have a referendum, you have whatever kind of debate. And then once you make this decision, the implications are that it's enforced on other people. And, to give a really good example, sewage. If you allow sewage to mix with drinking water, people will die of quite a long list of diseases, right? It's not instinctual. People do not have a natural sense that they shouldn't pollute their own drinking water. It's happened throughout history, even within Canada. Statistic I remember, in the 4 years before World War I in Canada, more people died because of sewage being in the drinking water, i.e. those diseases that are coming in the way, then died in combat in World War I in the 4 years following after. That's from memory. But obviously I read that in a book many years ago. So, it's one thing to say, look, this is a simple scientific fact. And sometimes it is. Sometimes don't eat your own poo. Don't drink your own poo. Like, yeah, it seems like a really scientific fact, simple scientific fact. But the political reality of that and the type of coercion that ensues, as it'll mean going onto people's farms and going into people's property. The government enforcing sewage regulations, what happens? What were then mostly outhouses, that kind of thing. And the implications for farming, cattle farming and pig farming, those things all produce. The long arm of the law reaching down into people's personal lives and really using coercion to end this kind of poisoning, this kind of self-poisoning of humanity. Right. Politically. Like, that sounds like a simple example, but politically it's really complex. But this is the point I put to you. Isn't it marvelous if you can say to people, we debated this at the Pnex. We debated this democratically. Yes. You had your chance to vote for it. And guess what? 65% of people voted. Like, after we discussed it, after everyone learned about this or learned about whatever percent, 65% of people said we have to get rid of this sewage problem. So fuck you. As opposed to, well, the Queen decided. So that's it. Ultimately, there's coercion involved, right? Ultimately, but as opposed to saying, well, the Queen decided this. Right. So if you don't understand it,
I will just say a good example that we recently looked into was the debate about abortion in Ireland.
Yes.
That this was a referendum, a national referendum. Yes. The idea that everybody was able to vote on this referendum. Not everybody did, but theoretically, yes, everybody in Ireland could vote on this, and they decided that abortion should be illegal.
Yes.
This is an example of democracy.
It's a very positive example. And in case you don't know, Ireland is still Catholic as hell, in case you hadn't heard. Yes.
Yes. Exactly. So despite the fact that they're a Catholic society, enough people voted and they decided on this thing that goes against Catholicism. Right. Because they're able to think it through enough. They've progressed past this certain point, right?
But look, I just want to say something. To take something implicit and make it explicit, right? The people make the laws. The laws do not make the people. And with that very simple example, the people of Ireland stood up and voted in a referendum. So now abortion is legal rather than illegal. Okay. It's the people making laws. There's more than one way to define democracy. This is a crucial aspect of just republicanism generally, whether or not it's democracy. This is part of the idea of the republic. And part of the problem with Americans, which again I address in this book, is that they have it the wrong way around. They think the laws create the people. The Constitution creates the people, creates the goodness of the American people, and it doesn't.
I agree. That's a good example where people can look back and say, okay, no, in 2018 we decided, people can still protest. People are still going to hold signs up, down at City Hall.
But for the next 50 years, it's probably settled.
We made this decision.
Sure.
And if you want to put it to a vote again, 10 years from now, we can.
I think more like 50 years now. I don't think it'll be that recent that soon that you'll have another vote.
Yes.
But but for the time being, this is what the democracy decided. This is what we're going to live with.
Right.
And look, again, no one looks back on this as a lost, as a higher level of civilization that we've lost. Both Athens and Sparta, the people directly voted before going to war. When was the last time the American people voted on whether they wanted to go to war or not, either for the start of a war or the end of a war? It has never happened once. Never once in the United States of America was there a referendum or any kind of direct vote on a war, whether a war should start or stop. So in this sense, this is just one of many criteria. Both Athens and Sparta were more democratic than the United States of America. And by the way, reading Sallust is not that well-known a name to Sallust. If you search the name Sallust in my channel, Sallust describes the way war was voted on in Rome. I feel that Rome was, to simplify, Rome was less democratic than Athens, but still they had a significant amount of democracy. And you actually get a sense of how the different bodies, the different semi-democratic bodies, jockeyed for position and contested and decided whether or not they're going to war. Go on.
So I wonder if this, this idea of not being able to vote to go to war can kind of relate to this other idea that I was thinking of while I was listening to you. That is correct. And you read about McNamara's, basically the people who they shouldn't have been serving in the army because they were actually too, their IQ was too low. They shouldn't have been able to serve in the army. This was during the Vietnam War. So they did not have the ability to vote on whether or not they would actually go to war. Yet they were drafted to go into the war, and many of them, had, I'm sure, terrible experiences in the army, because if they were really not intelligent to understand like how to shoot a gun, how to tie their shoelaces, that this is a real considerable problem. And it got me thinking earlier when you were talking about how it's not impossible to play the piano, and you want to sit down and like, if you really love somebody, you can sit down with them and say, look, it's not impossible for you. 1 million people can learn to play the piano per year. You can too, right? So maybe not 100% of the population will be able to learn piano, but I think you said like 100% of the population could.
They could, but they won't.
Right.
100% of people could be vegan, and they won't.
Right.
Yes.
But it is just kind of shocking when you think about how many people really can't understand these things.
Yes.
Or are not ready to understand.
I agree.
Yes, at a certain point, maybe 2 years old, you're too young to play this.
I agree, but I'm being honest with you when I say I believe AOC can't do it. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, I literally believe she is not intellectually capable, not emotionally capable, not ethically capable of participating in democracy. That's my opinion. Like obviously, I think everyone admits there's some point at which you're too mentally disabled to participate in democracy. Like some people are so mentally disabled they can't talk, they can't read. Yeah. Like they really that's how severe their disability. I get it, but I'm saying to you, if I'm really being honest, I perceive someone like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who's celebrated in this way. I look at her and I think you cannot participate in democracy. And sorry, I don't really know these people very well, but if you think of any kind of pop culture figure, Logan Paul, is Logan Paul too stupid, too immature? Because again, it's not just raw intelligence, right? Like I'm saying, you could take any Johnny Depp. Seriously, can Johnny Depp go to the Pnex? Can Johnny Depp participate in direct democracy or parliamentary democracy? Like Johnny Depp, most people regarded him as highly intelligent and shrewd and sophisticated. He had a certain ambiance of being a sophisticated man until a few months ago or something. And now all this testimony has come about the reality of his private life and how he lives. Like from my perspective, my point is not that Johnny Depp is retarded. That is not my point, whether or not it's true. I mean, I don't know if he can get a diagnosis for having limited cognitive capacity, because it turns out he's an amazingly stupid man. But, I'm just being honest with you, like in terms of what does it take to do what for me is now effortless, like playing the piano. You work at it hard enough for long enough, it becomes effortless. Well, I wasn't born this way. Decades of hard work have made it effortless for me to do what I'm doing right now, what I've done in over 1,000 YouTube videos. And guys, I can stand up in Parliament and do this, and I can stand in front of a corporate board of directors and do this. Like and it's not just about talking; it's about reasoning and all these other things that go into it. Okay, so it's become effortless for me. But yeah, I'm saying how many people can do this on my level? And look, sorry, George W. Bush is one of the most horrifying of all. I mean, you get someone so stupid in a position of power. I mean, AOC is stupid. Who's stupider, George W. Bush or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez? It's terrifying that you've had people so stupid in positions of such tremendous power. Yeah,
right. And I would be accepting of people like George Bush and you made this comparison, Johnny Depp or Logan Paul, if they were able to vote in a referendum like in Ireland that decided whether or not abortion should be legal. But you're talking about actually leading the nation or leading being an orator, like this. That yes, of course, that has demands more quickness, alacrity, intelligence, than just being a member of the voting public. So anyway, I guess I
Yeah.
I
Well,
got my
look,
point across.
look.
Though.
So I'll just say the image, of forcing your daughter to brush her teeth when she doesn't, she's not old or intelligent enough to understand why it's necessary to brush her teeth. That is an image found in ancient Buddhism, mutatis mutandis. One of the standard images used in Buddhist philosophy in the ancient period is of what to do when your small child, either an infant or a toddler, is choking on something, is choking on food. So I think people had this experience often enough that it was a vivid image they could relate to. And it describes having to reach your finger down the throat of the child in order to remove an obstruction to stop it from suffocating or choking to death. And that obviously the child doesn't enjoy this. Child may be terrified to have your hand or your finger go down their throat trying to stop them from choking. Right. And indeed, this may cause the child to vomit. You can imagine. But in the ancient world, this was the kind of medical emergency, and there is no 911, so on and so forth. This idea of having the prerogative, the privilege of being the adult who knows better, and who therefore imposes their will on the child. Now, look, I've written a whole book about this. So I mean, I could here. It's frankly, it would be quite easy for me to give a philosophical lecture about it, partly because I've rehearsed and gathered and organized my thoughts in No More Manifestos. The one thing I would say, so this isn't a multi-hour discussion of this aspect of democracy. The one thing I'd say is this: the more democracy you have, because throughout this whole video we've talked about the fact that it's not 0 or 100. It's not a binary. It's not like either you have democracy or you don't. You have slavery or you don't. You have veganism or you don't. These aren't simple all or nothing situations. But the more democracy you have, the less lazy the power elite gets to be. All right. Now, just say you can imagine if, let's say you were in the position of winning the civil war in Syria. Like within the next 5 years, you personally end up being the dictator of Syria on the basis of a huge pile of dead bodies. You fought this war, and the whole population, it's just the body count has been so huge, the civil war has been going on for so long, people step back and just say, okay, you're in charge. Like people resign themselves to it. Your faction, your military has dominated this society. I think you can imagine, at least for a 10-year period after the close of the Civil War, you would really be able to rule just by fiat. Whatever you say goes. You don't have to explain your plans to people. You don't have to reason them through. You don't have to deal with questions and answers about the implications. You don't have to modify your plans on the basis of feedback, right? So I'm just saying, getting this as it generally is true, whether it's 10 years or 5 years or 20 years. Very often, after a really hard conflict, you'll have a period where people are resigned to totally arbitrary political power, put it that way, whether it's tyrannical or not, right? People will just say, okay, we'll accept whoever's in charge because we're done with having so many thousands of people die per month, frankly, in a state of civil war. Okay, but then compare that to if you were a genuinely democratic leader in a society where all the major decisions involve a referendum and where you really have to go out from town to town. You have to go around in a van and give lectures and do Q&As from town to town across the country, explaining to people why this referendum is important, why your political position is correct, why they need to understand this. And again, it could be for a health issue like this. It could be for something that's from your perspective is scientifically simple. It could be from your perspective, this is just a simple scientific fact. We must brush our teeth or we must abolish circumcision. Well, okay, for me as an atheist, it's obvious that circumcision should be abolished. For Muslim people, it's not obvious. Right. For the majority of Jewish and Christian people, it's not obvious too. There's a really widespread phenomenon, this idea that cutting off part of your penis is a really great idea, guys. Yeah. Well, that, imagine actually going from town to town. And, look, I think it's been a long time since that happened in the United States of America. I think it's been a long time since it happened in France. Like we talk about different countries. When was there that spirit of democracy going from town to town? But, a really touching, a really moving example of that in American history was the basically coast-to-coast tour of LBJ's wife. So this is the President Lyndon Johnson. His wife, she really gave lectures going from town to town talking about why Black people should have political equality. Basically, that's what it was. She was from the far South. He was from Texas. And many of the crowds were very hostile. Like, you could hear it. Like people came and, people were sitting with their arms crossed. It was really an era when this is a very contentious idea. Now, in reality, they didn't have a referendum. They didn't have that kind of democracy. It was decided from the top down. It was one man made the decision. LBJ himself made the decision on an executive basis. They were going to have racial equality, and he imposed it. He imposed his will on everyone in America. And the history of exactly how that was possible and the ways in which it's connected to the assassination of the guy who was president immediately before him, there's a lot of interesting jiggery-pokery in how that was possible. But I would just say, even if you regard that just as political theater, as a kind of circus or sideshow, because the people didn't get to vote on it, they didn't get to have a referendum. And they didn't even elect Lyndon Johnson. They elected another guy who was shot in the head.
Yes.
You know, so there are a lot of ways in which it's undemocratic. You know, obviously, most people today are very happy that Lyndon Johnson did what he did in relation to the status of African Americans, former slaves, et cetera, in America. But my point is that there was that humility and willingness to go from town to town and engage people in that discussion, whether you think of that as public education or what have you. So that's the point I would say is dictatorial power, especially when dealing with a short-term emergency, it may be very appealing. It was in ancient Rome also. It was a crucial aspect of how ancient Roman government worked. Basically, whenever there was an emergency, they closed down the democratic society. They gave all the power to one dictator. And, you know, they had temporary dictatorship declared while they were fighting a particular war or some other crisis of this kind, war, civil war, that kind of thing. However, among the many problems of having, you know, fiat power in government, just power by decree, whether it's a kingdom, a monarchy, an aristocracy, or just a very corrupt system of democracy, like a society with very little democracy, is that the elite becomes lazy, you know, and they become lazy in that most important way, which is exactly, I mean, sorry, you said you've seen me trying to compel my daughter to brush her teeth, but you've also seen me explaining to her.
Yes. Oh,
You know,
yeah.
you've also
That's the
seen me,
main
right.
thing.
I mean, you just say that you've also seen
That's
me
the
intellectually.
strength
Right. And I'm preparing her for, like, it's like, even if you're too young to understand this now, you will. You've seen
Yes.
me philosophically and politically educating my daughter, where I'm having really sophisticated conversation with her,
Yes.
slowly, and in a
Mhm.
way she can understand. And I'm asking her questions and she's replying. So just say, even
Yeah.
that, you know, it's parallel to the laziness of a parent. If you're a parent who just gives commands and just gives orders, just says, you don't understand, you can't understand, as opposed to being a parent who really reasons these things through kind of democratically, even if you don't get equal votes, you know what I mean? Where it says, look, I need you to understand. So yeah, there's a kind of laziness to be
Yes.
avoided there that really matters.
I think
Go
that
ahead.
is absolutely
Yeah.
the strength of
Right.
that you should have when you are trying to coerce people into doing something that is the right thing to do. So I guess just
Right.
yeah.
So look, I'm going to bring this back to the real world in a way that's very palpable. Okay, within my lifetime, where is coercive veganism possible? So this is veganism by decree. That you just have a law or constitution saying within this territory there can be no animal slaughter, there can be no meat, butter, salt. It is possible. It is certainly possible, for example, with a small island where most of the money is made from tourism. You know, any of them, frankly. You get a tiny island like Tahiti or something, one of these small island nations. They could do it, and you could imagine it really being a kind of marketing ploy. Hey, come to the only vegan country in the world. The whole island is vegan. Yeah, it's frankly, sorry, maybe whether or not you think Tahiti is attainable. My point is any small island that primarily relies on international tourism for its revenues, the beauty of the island, and where they market it and say, hey, look, we have tropical fruit, we have all these wonderful things. We want to make this a holiday destination for tourists. That is not only possible, it is plausible, you know, that you can have an island where it's ecotourism and where they know that they have, like, there are beaches all over the world. There are beautiful beaches everywhere. And say, hey, we're the one island where all the food is vegan, where the whole country is vegan, even though it's a tiny country. Yeah, that's attainable. I would also say you could have particular provinces within India, you know, particular cities or particular provinces where for a small area within India, it's declared 100% vegan and there's no meat can be bought and sold in no slaughterhouses. Within Sri Lanka, hypothetically, I doubt it'll happen in Sri Lanka just based on my knowledge of the place. Within an intensely Buddhist society like Myanmar, you know, I think one you're familiar with, it's hard to imagine, but what about Taiwan? You know, Taiwan, the majority of people eat huge amounts of meat, but you could have a subculture within Taiwan that gathers in one town where there's one little province. They say, okay, within this province, everything's going to be vegan. Yes, it's possible. Yes, it's attainable. You know what I mean? But again, this relates back to everything I've discussed in this video. Okay, but what will be the significance of coercive veganism? Of it when people don't understand it, people don't accept it, or 90% of people, like maybe 10% of people in this island or in this, or maybe 10% of people really support the policy and really understand it, really understand why it's worth doing.
Yeah.
Right. But we're 90% of people. It's like I described before. If I married a religious person,
Right.
and I'm just coerced into being religious enough
Yes.
to keep the relationship going. And she may be coerced into being just atheist enough to satisfy me in this relationship.
Yes.
What is the value of having a society that is in this sense vegan enough through coercion? And look, again, this isn't that hypothetical. We just tested the waters. We just saw having a society that's vaccinated enough, right? Look, well, a lot of people don't accept the science behind the vaccine. A lot of people challenge it.
Yes.
And we saw crazy coercion. Each country was different. The story of coercion in Australia, in France, like it's really different.
Yes.
If you guys watch the debate between Macron and Le Pen, this is the debate for who would be the next leader of France, you will notice that at one point, Macron says to Le Pen, he says it as if it's self-evidently ridiculous. Well, if what you want is to enforce secularism, I would say atheism, but they say secularism in French. If what you want is to enforce secularism, are you comfortable with a police officer running down the street and arresting someone for wearing a headscarf, a Muslim headscarf? And what she said back, she's not a very witty or fast-thinking woman. What Le Pen said back was, well, haven't you noticed we just had the police running down the street to arrest someone over a mask, over wearing or not wearing a mask? This is not shallow. This is not trivial. So we've just lived through a great kind of test case for coercion. And again, I've made videos talking about what happened in China with Xinjiang. It's another very interesting test case.
And can you imagine if even one country had made it a vote? Like,
yes,
okay,
right,
let's
yes.
vote on what we should do.
Sure.
Should we shut down all gyms? Should we shut down?
Yeah, right, right.
Couldn't that have been voted on by somebody?
Well, and imagine each city having a vote too. Like I just say, it doesn't necessarily have to be national. Colorado could have had a referendum, Colorado City, Colorado. I'm just saying each city or something could have had direct democracy on these things. And I can imagine
you get to live with that consequence.
Yes,
say,
that's right. That's right. We were the city.
Decided
right.
Now
we have to live with the
Denver,
consequences.
There's not going to be any mask requirements.
Right.
This is voted on. We are the one place that is,
right. And then some other place they would have voted another way, and you'd get to compare the outcomes.
Because of these, I really appreciate what you said about the short-term emergency and like that. This is how the legal system is operating in America. That we're using these little scraps of paper that are the result of short-term emergencies. The decisions that were made at one time or another by people who are dead now, and we don't have to be. We don't have to be living under their influence forever. This is
yes.
And
okay, so I really dislike Thomas Jefferson as a person. I'm not a fan of Thomas Jefferson. But one of the things he said again and again is that laws are a way for the living to be bullied by the dead. That our dead ancestors are bullying us, are coercing us through laws. Now, many people interpret this in terms of his own decision to not keep his promises to his deceased wife. It's an interesting aspect. He felt that the promises he made to his wife were only valid while she was alive. This is apparently part of his philosophy. Now that she's dead, he's got to do his own thing. Life is for the living. So that was part of his philosophy. Whether or not that related to his own sex life, and that's another story. But politically, it's interesting that he came to the conclusion he wanted all laws and all constitutions to be written anew. I'm sorry, I forget if it was every 30 years, but it's something like that. He had a time scale. I think it was in dozens of years or something. It was like every 3 dozen years or something. I'm sorry, the exact numbers I forget. But he felt that laws should elapse. And there should be new laws written, and constitutions should elapse. And you have to write a totally new constitution every so many years. That people should come together. That it was really important not to allow the spirits of the dead to have coercive power over the living, that life is for the living and that law is for the living, and to cut off this kind of endless cycle of bullying, for lack of a better term, of coercion. Coercion across the generations should be cut off. It should be for one generation only.
It's great. Yeah. That's a great comment, I think, because it makes me think, how much more involved would people be if those were the stakes, that every 30 years or however many years, that we had to come to this conclusion. Something that I was thinking about when you were reading the messages that you got, the private messages, for somebody like that who had decided to be vegan for 4 years, or vegetarian, my ex-boyfriend, he became vegan for me, and the minute that we broke up, he stopped being vegan. So this happens.
My ex-wife, similar story. Yeah. Not exactly similar story.
I would like to think that if those two people, those two examples of people who at one time or another were, believed in veganism enough, or at least had thought through the principles enough that they agreed to live this way, and change their lifestyle, change how they made food in their homes, and what they did when they were out and about, what kind of places you can go and where you can eat, adding these restrictions to your life, if they had lived in a society that did coerce them into doing this, do you think at some stage they would reach that level of acceptance, and then even though they were coerced into it at one point or another, then they would realize that it's the right thing to do? So that's
well, I mean, I think the two aspects. One, a marriage is a society of just two people, and that's exactly what you're dealing with. And the other is, Max Stirner talks about this a lot too, the type of obedience you get in society with law. Like, in some ways, talking about laws and constitutions is profoundly irrelevant to what we're talking about, because we want to talk about the actual will of the people. The will of the people is not the law. It's not the Constitution. You know what I mean? But the type of obedience you can extract is normally about as much as the obedience of traffic laws. People will drive faster than the speed limit whenever they can.
That's really true.
I've never met anyone who believes in the principle of the speed limit. They only respond to coercion. They only respond to the threat of fines and imprisonment. And in the 21st century, this has changed, because now there can be these hidden cameras. Now there's this. But in the past, when I was a kid, it was really there were some highways where you could get away with speeding. And many people, I remember seeing adults sitting around and discussing it, which highways you could drive what speed on, because they would keep a mental map of where the police, would arrest people and where they wouldn't, and so on. The de facto speed limit. So that is generally the type of obedience you can compel from people. Now, with that having been said, if the existence of planet Earth depends on it, if we're talking about global warming, we're talking about ocean acidification, rising carbon levels in the atmosphere, changing the chemical composition of the ocean, and then this really bringing about a terrible doomsday scenario. This is not the only problem with global warming, but it's the one I choose to emphasize for various reasons that I've made videos talking about in the past. If we're really dealing with apocalyptic consequences, maybe driving the speed limit, maybe that is the kind of thing we have to work with. But the emphasis I'm placing on, in my analysis, I'm placing emphasis on the laziness of the ruling class, the laziness of the elite, as compared to the intellectual dynamism that democracy fosters. And again, it's not 100 or 0, but by having more democracy, you get more education. And look, I'm Canadian. My real sincere feeling is that Canadians are so intellectually lazy because they can be, because they can get away with it. And I don't want that. I want this kind of democracy that really, really, inspires and stimulates and motivates intellectual dynamism for the elite, and where people, frankly, become elite because of their intellectual dynamism, their active research and informed opinion, because of what they can contribute positively to democracy in that way, whether that's as intellectual dissidents or as conformists. Yeah. Okay, guys, I'm catching up with your written comments now. So with several people asking if my books are on sale, I thought it was obvious from what I said before, but one of my books you can get on Amazon right now for about $1. In Europe, it is exactly 99 cents in Europe. In America, I believe it's $1.08. So I'm not trying to turn a profit on that book, obviously. You can get that on Amazon. The second book, No More Manifestos, is not out yet, but many chapters of it have been shared within Patreon. So again, if you pay $1 within Patreon, you could read several chapters of it. And some people talk about it as if it has already been published because the chapters have been shared, because they've read a certain number of chapters of it. So here you go. I will post the link in the chat. Oh. And yes, as with everything on Amazon, there's a separate page for each country. So there's a Canadian page, an American page, a Japanese. So yeah, I've seen it. Go to Amazon Japan, and you can order it Japan, so on and so forth. Great question. I mean, seemingly unrelated, but profoundly related. Quote, do you hold Nikocado Avocado solely responsible for the path he's currently on? Or do you consider him a product of coercion within a sick society of misaligned incentives? So I'll give you my answer because you asked me. I hold Nikocado Avocado 100% responsible and solely responsible. It's just well phrased, your question. Yes, I do. Do we live in a society where the majority of people instead see him as the victim of, outside forces or something? That's probably a more important question. But yeah, I see him absolutely 100% responsible. Now, both Melissa and I have people in our families who drink too much alcohol and whose lives have been ruined by alcohol. I'm not going to specify this, but both Melissa and I have. For you in the audience, most of you have probably at least one relative somewhere. Do I hold those people solely responsible for being a drunk, being an alcoholic, the way in which alcohol has ruined their life? Yes. Yes, I do. I hold them 100% solely responsible. And in as much as any of those people have ever talked to me, that's what I've said to them face to face. I've said, it's on you. Now, I'll just give you a more complex example. And look, sorry, why? Sobriety is something you do alone. It doesn't rely on an institution. It doesn't rely on having access to a library. It doesn't rely on you having a teacher. Now, learning to read Braille, by touch, I have to specify, because some people actually, if you can see, they learn to read, but only by looking at Braille. I have been told, I have both read descriptions of this and on YouTube heard descriptions, you really need a teacher, you really need a certain kind of institution to get the knack of using your sense of touch. It's quite a complex process to master reading Braille, reading sign language, using sign language, okay? If you ask someone, look, why haven't you learned to read Braille? Why haven't you learned sign language? That's much harder to put on one person, right? They may really be able to say, look, where I live, I didn't have access to the institutions, the resources, the help, the support I need to learn Braille or learn sign language, right? And I myself, when you look at my life, there are a lot of things that have gone horribly wrong where I can't say it's on me. I can't say it's all my fault, because there's this kind of institutional context, this kind of political context that's made what I wanted to do impossible, where it relied on other people and what have you, But no, these kinds of examples, it's 100% on that person. I'm sorry, I will return to reading and replying to the comments, the comments that I'm leaving anonymous that inspired this video. So. So look, here's a great example. Sorry, Frida. Frida had a couple comments I wanted to respond to. Frida says, quote, even with applying sunscreen to prevent skin cancer, many people don't know how important this is. That's what Frida says. So Frida, I've done some scientific research on this. And purely on the basis of science, I believe sunscreen, meaning suntan lotion, the lotion applied to your skin, I believe it's a scam. 100% based on scientific evidence, not based on anything else. And my claims are not crazy. I mean, if you want to do the reading, you can. I read one article about it that was in The Ecologist magazine. So I recall, I think it was a Dutch magazine that published in English. I think that was the situation with that magazine. If not, maybe it was a British version of a Dutch publication. But it was this, I read this completely well-researched, scientific, factual article, in no way based on religious claims or whatever. And it's like, guess what? You know what the world's most effective sunscreen is? It's wearing a hat. It's wearing a shirt made of solid cotton. Like, this is a complete joke to think you can have a translucent liquid that you rub on your skin that's effective in preventing the damage of the sun. And do you think you can rub this liquid on your skin, then swim in the ocean with this on your skin, and then get out of the ocean and it's still there, invisibly blocking and reflecting the sun's rays? There's a lot of wishful thinking. So, like, my point is not to say you're wrong, you're an idiot or something. My point is, you've raised this as an example of something that's scientifically simple and self-evident, right? I've done a little bit of research on it, and I'm saying to you, no, you're wrong. Now, if you have a good democratic process, those kinds of things can come out. All right. It is obvious to me that antidepressant drugs like Prozac don't work. And it's so obvious. I totally talk about it as a self-evident scientific fact, right? And I can't believe anyone who does the reading doesn't discover the same thing I do, right? Well, imagine if you really had a democratic process of debate to draw those things out, to really engage the public in those arguments. And like, I completely admit, back in 1985, probably everyone would have voted to make antidepressants legal and to have the government pay for them, make them free for everyone who wanted to take them. But like by 1995, by 2005, by 2015, like, scientifically, it becomes more and more evident that these drugs don't work and they have terrible negative effects. So now, none of us have experience with this. Nobody in the world lives in a society where even matters of scientific fact, matters of science and health policy are decided democratically. So there's a real sense in which we don't know what that would be like. We do not know what it would be like in which the general public decides these things, and not secret closed-door meetings between leaders of industry and a small number of government bureaucrats. That's how it's decided, not just in the United States, but in most countries in Europe. The last description that I kind of read, I think it was in Denmark. But I mean, some of the supposedly good democracies in Europe, you read about the actual meetings that took place between these incredibly wealthy corporations and, the representatives of the Department for Health and Safety or whatever it was. And there is in effect money on the table. There's real patronage. And, it's just horrifying. The decisions that are made, quote unquote, in the public interest that are not democratic or not in the public interest. And, it's now relatively well known, I think in large part thanks to vegan activism. The way in which health policy was developed for the American diet, the so-called food pyramid, the role of lobbying of the meat industry, the dairy industry, and so on, lobbying. So, yeah, how much democracy is enough democracy, and what would happen? Because, guys, I'm skeptical. If you had more democracy, maybe the health guidelines in America would be worse, but over time, that would intensify the level of political education, the level of political engagement. Like, maybe at first, more than 50% of Americans just want to say cigarettes are healthy, beer is healthy, alcohol is healthy. They like pork, so they want to say pork is healthy. And maybe that at first, in the 1950s, is what democracy is tending towards. But maybe decade by decade, you start to get, again, because the elite then has to work hard. The elite can't just be fatuous and disengaged. The elite gets out there and really engages people and says, look, these are the consequences of drinking alcohol. These are the consequences of smoking cigarettes. This is the consequence of having cholesterol in your diet, whether that cholesterol comes from pork or cheese. and then start to make laws that make sense. I'm not recklessly optimistic, but the point is, the choice you have to make is, how democratic a country do you want to be? Again, read my book, read No More Manifestos, especially. But, I do not believe that aristocracy is the way forward. And I do believe that aristocracy is the system of government we now have.
I do want to say something, but I don't.
Do it. It's a good time.
Yeah, I do want to say something about it. I don't want to get too off topic, but it was just kind of amazing to me to think of the public health crisis that we've just gone through, and all of the diseases that I know to be preventable because I'm vegan, because I've done the research, that there isn't coercion on this scale. Yes. There was so much, about, making sure that you're vaccinated, making sure that you're wearing your mask, closing down restaurants, closing down gyms, just the scale of, coercion in this. And where is it for heart disease? Where is it for diabetes? And Nikocado Avocado, I'm sure he's diabetic now. If he hasn't been diagnosed, I'm sure he will be soon. This is an example of somebody who went from being healthy to having these problems with obesity. Probably he's been hospitalized for heart disease. He is an example of just how quickly this can happen because you're not eating a vegan diet. It's not like he's got some genetic predisposition to becoming obese, and that's why he's, experiencing or heart disease or diabetes. It's the diet. So anyway,
Well, okay. Look, I just want to say, Steve, for 1 second. You say it's surprising there isn't more coercion on these issues. But I think the very simple answer, or my response to that, is to say, where does coercion come from? And where does it go in any of these societies? Now, Iraq has a democracy. It has a democracy that was introduced by the American military. But they have votes, they have elections, so on and so forth. There is coercion of Sunni against Shiite, Shiite against Sunni. You know what I mean? And they know what they're doing. They know where the coercion comes from. They know where it's going. There's a sense of an objective, right? With something like health, with something like education also, right? Coercion is very rare in society because there isn't a clear sense of a particular outcome and there isn't a particular constituency demanding it, right? So you think about in politics, where does coercion come from? And where's it going? What do I mean is coercion normally arises when there is a definite constituency demanding it and where there is an objective, however palpable or impalpable, that this constituency understands, that they desire, that they want to achieve. So those are the normal political preconditions for coercion. So, atherosclerosis. If you don't know what atherosclerosis means, you should. Atherosclerosis. An incredibly high percentage of Americans have atherosclerosis. It would only be a slight exaggeration to say it affects everyone. Basically, everyone who is not vegan in the United States of America. It's only a slight exaggeration. It's a rounding error. The vast majority of Americans, atherosclerosis is a problem. Atherosclerosis can result in damage to your heart. It can result in damage to your brain. And one of the most common also results in erectile dysfunction from that. So it's not going to be your whole circulatory system is impacted.
And your limbs.
And of course, it also can result in death, premature death. But the loss of quality of life, the loss of your ability to think, the loss of your ability to walk upstairs, atherosclerosis. But, is there one particular constituency and one particular outcome? The benefit of addressing atherosclerosis is incredibly diffuse, right? And there isn't a concentrated particular special interest group pressing for it. Now, guys, when you think special interest group, many of you, especially if you're vegan, will start to think about the corrupting influence of the pharmaceutical industry, this kind of conspiracy thing with these things. Okay, but I'm going to give you a positive example. Gay rights. Who was the constituency pressing for gay rights? There was a very obvious special minority group, special interest group, right? And it wasn't the majority. It was a minority of people, right? What was the outcome? What was the, what was the destination? So one of the examples I like to give is forcing school boards, forcing the school system to be willing to hire and employ an openly homosexual teacher. This is coercion. Before, none of them wanted to do it. It was a very widespread prejudice that you couldn't have a gay or lesbian teacher, but especially gay men were excluded from this kind of profession. Okay, so this is coercion. Now, again, there are also some things with housing and rent that someone should be able to be openly gay and still rent a home, have no prejudice in this sense.
Yeah, which is still federally,
right.
Yeah.
It's still legally an issue, yes. But my point is to say there was a constituency, there's a definite outcome or destination from this, coercion arises. Yes. So that's, I think, I'm sorry. I mean, for some of you guys, this may be obvious, but for some of you, it's the first time you're thinking it through in your life.
No, that is interesting. Yeah. To make that comparison, because, I can think of some campaigns that were exceedingly prevalent when I was growing up, for this one type of cancer, for breast cancer.
Yes.
Breast cancer awareness. It's, I don't know if it's not a special
so
interest.
Strange kind of dynamism to it.
Been,
but let me give you one more example. Some of you will relate to this viscerally, know exactly what I'm talking about. And some of you'll have to use your imagination. Rats make people's lives miserable every day in the city and in the countryside, being beset by rats, being marauded by rats. You may not know this, but Australia is a great example. Australia is totally infested with rats, or plagues of rats, millions and billions of rats, huge numbers of rats. New York City is infested by rats. In Canada, we have one province called Alberta. It's a huge area. It's bigger than, I think, any country in Europe, but it's bigger than I'm sorry. Now, some of you can Google it. How big is Alberta compared to France, metropolitan France? How big is Alberta compared to Germany? Anyway, Alberta has a lot of landmass. It's not a small state like Delaware or something. It's a huge area, Alberta. Okay. In Alberta, there are no rats. Zero, because of a government policy. This is attainable for Alberta. It's totally attainable for Australia. In case you didn't know, Australia is an island. It's Australia as a whole and Tasmania. All right. We can live without rats. And in most of these places, the rats you're talking about are not indigenous. They were introduced with the arrival of white people. Another great example, by the way, is Hawaii. Rats. Okay. But rats make everyone's life miserable. We have rats, not inside our apartment, but here around our apartment building, we see rats. We live surrounded by rats. And if you've had rats inside your home, if you've had to live inside your farm or eating your vegetables, we've had rats eating the plants we were farming. Okay. Now I'm using this intentionally because it's a very challenging example for vegans. Okay. If we eliminate rats the way Alberta did, everyone will benefit. Literally everybody in society, the rich and the poor. Rich people got to deal with it. It's horrible. If you own a big property as a rich, you can be a millionaire and you still have to deal with rats. But of course, poor people in the slums, poor people in the ghetto, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. But there's no special interest, there's no constituency. And that outcome, right? Who can see it? Who can visualize it? Who can measure it and quantify it and say, look, this is worth $1 billion.
Right.
Like the improvement in our lives. And indeed, you could calculate it. How much will you save in agriculture costs? Even with the building we used to live in. So not the building we have now, but I talked about this in a YouTube video 5 years ago or something. But, I remember talking to the manager of the building. They had to have rat killers come every week. They had a pest control company coming every week to check on trap for rats, cockroaches, pigeons. And I talked about this in terms of the contradictions of veganism, that, you pay rent, you're paying someone to kill rats on your behalf. That's you may say you don't kill rats. Well, you rent an apartment and a certain percentage of your apartment is going to.
Absolutely. But that
my point is, but if you calculate the benefit, every apartment building in the country paying for pest control, every farm paying for pest control or somehow managing killing and poisoning rats, right? This is worth billions of dollars. This is a huge problem with the solution, and nobody wants to solve it. Yeah. So I put it under that heading.
I know
it's diffuse in its benefits.
Yeah,
and look, guys,
you would think that would be the case with hospitals.
I know, with heart disease, with atherosclerosis. I know. Wait, but look, here's the problem. Yeah. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez can't talk like this. All right. I'm sorry, but like, this is the tragedy. I listened to a lot of Bernie Sanders. I had many YouTube videos responding to Bernie Sanders.
Yeah.
Bernie Sanders is also not in my level.
I
So
know.
like, I wish I could tell you there are all kinds of brilliant political leaders I could look up to who have a nuanced understanding of stuff. Bob Ray is not on my level. Holy shit. Let's get into Canadian politicians who are not. Like, I wish I could tell you we have a culture that's crowded with dissident intellectuals like me, or even conformist intellectuals who really, like, who are able to do. This is not scripted. This is completely spontaneous, to deal with these issues and start thinking about it. But we don't. I have no contemporaries. You know, I'm all alone in just even being able to talk this stuff through with my audience. Okay, great.
Yep.
Yeah. This is why I like doing this as live stream, because a lot of these issues, I think they really are meaningful and important for whoever gets to hear this. But they're not issues I would ever make a standalone video about. Like, I wouldn't sit to think down and record a video in that way. Guys, if you have a second, hit the thumbs up button. Please do. It'll help more people discover this, both while the conversation is going and after the fact. Catching up with your comments. Ooh, here's an irrelevant but interesting question. Clouds asked, or Cloud says, quote, "I'm aware you're critical of the English translation of Max Stirner. Do you have any recommendations to learn about his philosophy despite the translation?" I saw someone asking about this on Reddit yesterday, and I was tempted to type out a whole essay. Okay, so really briefly, if you guys don't know who Max Stirner is, I have made videos in the past. You can search just for the name, search for the name Max. I think he's the only person called Max I've talked about. But I have made videos discussing the philosophy of Max Stirner in the past. There are basically three problems. One is just the quality of translation itself. Two, there's a special problem with the use of the conjunctive voices in German. Konjunktiv, eins, zwei, drei. You know, Stirner very often uses this sort of hypothetical voice. It's not that it's impossible to translate, but to my knowledge, the available translations struggle with this. That sometimes makes it hard to understand, sometimes means you lose the sense of humor or what it is he's getting at or why he's saying things the way he does. But the third problem is understanding the historical context. When Max Stirner uses the word liberal, he's discussing what liberalism meant in Germany at that time, which is unbelievably different from what liberalism means for us here and now, what it means in 2022 in Miami, Florida or something. So, you know, those are the problems, and they're kind of three separate but related problems. And you know, what other languages do you speak? I mean, I don't know if the Spanish translation is better of Stirner. I don't know if the Russian translation is better. You know, I suspect that it is. But all three of those problems, as far as I know, are impossible to overcome. They're just something you can cope with. I knew the political and historical context quite well when I started reading Stirner. I learned more while I read it, but I'd already done a lot of research about that period, you know, to understand people like Karl Marx and these other people. And then, yeah, I mean, the other thing to remember is you also, to some extent, need to know the people Stirner is criticizing, many of whom were much more famous and politically influential at that time than Karl Marx, but they've now been forgotten, you know. And those names are in the book explicitly. Like, it's not like I'm saying you have to imagine. Like, he names the people he's criticizing, but to understand who they were. Many people read Stirner and think that it's kind of crazy and over the top for those reasons. Like, oh, what he's saying about liberalism is completely crazy. But they don't understand what liberalism meant at that time in that culture, in that geographical and chronological context. And once you do, it's not so crazy. And again, his criticism of these other particular authors and thinkers, when you've seen how crazy they are, then what he's saying about them starts to make sense. But I just say I find it touching that there are young people on the internet today who are really moved by Stirner and really motivated to change something in their own lives. But Stirner is pretty much incomprehensible and unapproachable in modern English and from a 21st century perspective, like unless you've done all this research on the political context. And so like it's not with any egoism, that I'd really recommend reading my own books instead. I'd recommend watching my own videos about nihilism and my own videos about Max Stirner too. But reading Future of an Illusion, reading No More Manifestos, these are the two books I've just written within the last couple months or whatever. Those, I really think that's much more useful for everyone. And, okay, but conversely, it's a brief statement on Stirner. Might as well wrap it up. Why is Stirner worth reading? Well, understanding Stirner lets you understand Karl Marx, and from obviously an anti-Marxist perspective, it really lets you understand that. Understanding Stirner lets you understand Hegel, again, from an anti-Hegelian perspective. So there were a lot of famous, well, it lets you understand Immanuel Kant to some extent too. It's not so much, but indirectly, a lot of these names from that period, they've become these kind of unquestioned, impossible to challenge giants in philosophy, and specifically and especially in political philosophy. It's insane. I don't know, why would anyone respect Immanuel Kant's opinion about politics? Why would anyone respect what Hegel has to say about politics? Why would anyone respect what Karl Marx has to say about China, what Karl Marx has to say about India? It's insane. But those names have become towering. So taking the time to understand Stirner and the political context he wrote in, and, yes, it's meaningful in that way, is part of the demolition of the 19th century mystique, Hegel, Marx, et cetera, et cetera. Give another specific example. It's somewhat useful in understanding the origins of anthropology and how those are being contested. Some of the big tectonic changes that were happening in philosophy, politics, academia. And yeah, I mean, Stirner is also a voice in the political and philosophical response to economics emerging as a science and as a trade. And then a lot of what went on in political philosophy for 100 years was a response to that. So, yeah, it's meaningful, it's rewarding in those ways. But for you, for your life, for what you're going to do in the next 5 years, again, with no egoism, I think my own writing is way more important. And, Stirner can't compete with it for those reasons. But understanding the time in which Stirner was alive, of Stirner's writing, is way better. And again, Stirner, it does just kind of shine this light on Karl Marx, on Hegel, on Feuerbach, on these other philosophers of that time. That then it's very mutually illuminating. You can understand everything going on. And you understand the way in which people today misunderstand all this stuff. Oh, right. Now, how could I forget? Friedrich Nietzsche. I mean, like, that's the funny thing about Stirner. Stirner, without ever writing about Nietzsche, I mean, Nietzsche's work is partly derivative of Stirner. Like, my point is, it's not the other way around. Stirner is not derivative of Nietzsche. Nietzsche read and was partly inspired by Stirner. But Stirner, in effect, debunks Nietzsche, even though this is chronologically impossible. I would even say Stirner debunks Schopenhauer to some extent. So a lot of what was going on in Germany at that time, and including after Stirner's death, the fame or flourishing of Nietzsche being subsequent, a lot of it is kind of, again, this mutually illuminating way. If you want to understand that period, and some of those names are still important to some people, sure, that's valuable. But what you're doing with the next 5 years of your life, what we're all going to do in the next 50 years, I'm sorry, it's not Stirner. You got to read Islemazard. And what am I going to tell you? Do I have a lot of competition? Who do you know who's better publishing books on veganism? Who do you know who's better publishing books about nihilism? Political philosophy, really radical dissident political philosophy. I don't have a lot of competition, guys. Like, oh yeah, if anyone writes into me saying, I liked your book, but compared to Peter Singer, compared to Gary Francione, I have very little competition in both. But yeah, no, but legitimately, like I'll say this both to flatter myself and to flatter Stirner. Sure, Stirner is my competition. He's absolutely a book on the same shelf with my books, absolutely. But ethically, emotionally, and intellectually, I think my books outclass Stirner. Stirner did what he could, but he only took it so far. As you know, Stirner wasn't vegan. Infamously, he opened a milk shop. He opened a milk shop on kind of quasi-communist principles, a kind of workers' co-op, workers' collective milk shop to try to benefit the dairy farmers kind of thing. And it failed. But also his theory of politics and theory of democracy and so on, he could only take it so far. He kind of takes the critique and its implications only up to this limited point, and I go much further. But yeah, I mean, what can I tell you? There's a reason why for so many centuries people have drawn a kind of motivation and inspiration from Stirner. And I absolutely aspire to that same position. I hope that 200 years after I've died, I hope people still really are finding a kind of inspiration in these two books I've written, even if they're the last two books I ever write. I certainly do not intend to ever write a second book comparable to No More Manifestos. I mean that to be my really final statement about politics and political philosophy. That's why I've taken so much time with it, to be this kind of definitive statement. But there's all kinds of other writing I'd like to do. I currently very much have in mind writing a comedy, a comedic novel, or a novel that is a comedy. I'd like to do comedy writing. There's a lot of other creative writing I'd like to do. And I may go into filmmaking, and I may go into stand-up comedy and so on. But I do not see the rest of my life as being a reiteration of the principles set down in No More Manifestos, nor a reiteration explained in Future of an Illusion. And again, I've said this before, but very briefly, the material that is in my book, Future of an Illusion, it is not on this channel. It is not repeating or reiterating what you will see or hear in any of my YouTube videos. Oh, is King of Kanto here in the audience? That's weird. I guess King of Kanto must have me blocked, and then I can't see his or her comments. That's kind of funny. So I have people here replying to King. Oh no! Oh, there we go. Sorry. So King of Kanto asks, here's a really deep question. Hey, if I go vegan, can I lose 86 kilos by December? I assume this is a joke. So, but I will choose to take this joke seriously. You can lose weight on any diet. The question is, what kind of person do you want to be? If you ask me, can you lose weight in a diet that consists of coffee, whiskey, and bacon? The answer is yes, you can. What kind of person do you want to be? I do not want to be the motherfucker who lost 60 pounds on coffee, whiskey, and bacon. Okay? I don't want to be the person who makes excuses for smoking cigarettes, who makes excuses for drinking alcohol, or makes excuses for, raising pigs in captivity, slitting their throats and eating their flesh. That's not who I want to be. Okay? Can you lose weight on a vegan diet? Yes. Can you gain weight on a vegan diet? Yes. Ultimately, either you're vegan or not, because you're capable of understanding that it's the right thing to do. There are all kinds of fad diets that are well documented on the internet, and all of them can work, Most other people had much more encouraging replies to that. Someone recommends smoothies with green smoothies with black pepper and turmeric. You ever put black pepper and turmeric in a smoothie? Man, guessing that clears your sinuses. So look, Henry Gann says, and by the way, I don't take this as a stupid or shallow comment. Henry Gann says, quote, the eradication of smallpox points to the possibility of the world coming together in certain circumstances. That's right. That's right. There are numerous examples of that. And in a sense, when you examine the political history of those, they're more worrying than they are encouraging. America made seatbelts mandatory in a very peculiar political process. Was it democratic? No. A small minority of people who cared a lot about seatbelts got this law passed. It's interesting. But when things have happened nominally in the public interest that are ushered into existence through small numbers of elites coming together to make it happen, I'd mention also the real history of how workplace health and safety standards were passed in the United States in all 50 states. It's interesting, but again, once you kind of scratch the surface, once you really look into the process whereby these legal changes happened, it's more worrying than it is encouraging. But yes, no, there are. I mean, I think, obviously, I don't know if anyone here thought I was pessimistic about democracy. I'm just trying to really talk through the issues and all their implications, and not in a shallow way. But it would be completely ridiculous for someone to say democracy never works, or for someone to say that referendums never work. And it's always amused me that the British will so shamelessly say that. They had a referendum in England, so-called Brexit referendum, and you really got to see how aristocratic the British still are. Face to face, I heard so many British people saying openly, shamelessly, well, you see, this is why democracy can never work. This is why letting the people vote on these things can never really completely. Yeah. And, we also have to, obviously you guys are entitled to draw your own conclusions. Tell me something. Did democracy work? Like, look back at Brexit. Look what happened. All the doomsayers and the economic forecast, and all this bullshit that went on with Brexit. I mean, is Brexit a positive example or a negative example? So, the British are incredibly uncomfortable with this, and that's a problem. That indicates a deep problem in their society that has to be addressed one way or the other. Democracy in Libya. We just read an article about it the other day. Sorry? Tunisia? Yes, thank you, my sweet. Democracy in Tunisia. Yeah, I still think of it as Tunis for some reason rather than Tunisia. I don't know why. It's just probably I've read too many documents from an older era. But yeah, yeah, we have a lot of tough questions about democracy, but it's just as misleading to ignore the successes as it is to ignore the failures. And I mean, every empire that ever existed used the excuse the people are not ready for democracy. The people are not mature enough for democracy. In the British Empire, they especially like to say that the people are not masculine enough, that the people are still too effeminate. That was really the wording used in the British Empire. Interestingly, yeah. The men were still too effeminate to take up the very masculine responsibility of democracy and so on. It's anyway, people they're quick to justify the notion that democracy one day, but not yet. Oh, sure. But look, even South Korea, that today is a very successful democracy. You can criticize democracy in South Korea. I'm not saying nothing's wrong with it, but they had a long period of transitional dictatorship, before they got democracy. There was a real question. How much democracy, how soon would the South Korean people be able to handle, So again, someone called Moonin Smith says, quote, SSRIs are fundamentally dangerous to society, in my opinion. We have made many, many YouTube videos talking about this. I have a playlist that is called Antidepressants. I can get it for you, but I just look it up. I say we because my girlfriend really has been part of that. But there were just many, many, many videos already discussing that, and passionately on my channel. So I'm not going to get into it here. But to say I am antidepressants is an understatement. I'm a passionate advocate on that issue and have been for, I don't know, more than 10 years, whatever it is. And look, I just say Melissa and I have talked about it. Like, that's such an important issue. We sometimes have conversations like, look, do you want to let this take over our lives? Like, do you want to let activism or lobbying government or public education be our full-time? Like, we can start a foundation and start collecting donations to make this our full-time profession. But do you want to let this take over your life or not? So no, it's a tremendously important question. Yeah. White rice, yellow lentils, and a multivitamin are all you need. So that's this comment from MX2 in the audience. So I just want to ask MX2, I don't know if he's still here, he or she, but it looks like a he. Have you ever lived that way? Because I have. I have lived literally on nothing but white rice, yellow lentils, and a multivitamin. And I didn't even drink fruit juice or drink soy milk. I have lived for periods of time where that was all I ate. It was a multivitamin pill, white rice and yellow lentils. And there was a period of time when I had garlic also, which was a delight, to have garlic with it. And then I had a period of time where there was no more garlic and it was just white rice. Yeah. And as you may be guessing correctly, this was due to absolute scarcity when I was living in northwestern Laos. And I remember, so these were very poor people in northwestern Laos. That's why we were there. But to be fair, the people who were in the town were not the poorest of the poor. Like the poorest of the poor were living in caves in the wilderness, living in a shanty. And the people who were in the town, they're poor. Really, their total income less than $15 a month. But still, they weren't the poorest of the poor. There were people who didn't have homes or didn't have houses or weren't in the town who were even poorer than that. But even as desperately poor as the people there were, they all knew I was vegetarian or vegan, however you want to put it. Like I'm just saying in their culture, however they thought of this. I remember there's one moment I remember especially, but there were a couple moments of this. There's one moment where this woman who was herself a poor farmer, she saw me delighted to find a single mango that had dropped from a mango tree. I hadn't eaten any fruit in such a long time. I'd just been eating white rice, yellow lentils, etc. And I was so happy to see this mango that had dropped from a tree, and I ran over and picked it up. And then I discovered, it was absolutely inedible. It was totally as hard as it was one of those mangoes that fell prematurely. It was inedible. And whatever the expression of my face was, she found it heartbreaking. She was totally emotionally moved by this. And she beckoned me over and she said, here, I forget what she gave me. She had some kind of fruit or vegetable in her hovel that she got of me because she reckoned she knew starvation. She knew whatever the look on my face was. And again, in my case, it wasn't absolute starvation. I had white rice, yellow lentils, and a vitamin pill, but I had nothing else. Nothing. Not even garlic anymore, So that was really an incredibly monotonous and limited diet. And if I didn't have the vitamin pills, I would have died, I'm sure, So yeah, that's the most extreme. I mean, it was forced by circumstances. But yeah, the other thing I could have eaten was meat, right? The other available food. Anyway, I'm sorry, I don't remember what the fruit or vegetable was that she had to hand to me. If I dug in my memory, there was something she could give me, some kind of, but she knew. She knew. I mean, I think in their culture, they just think of me as a Buddhist vegetarian, as this strictly Buddhist vegetarian, and what that meant to them. I don't know. Yep, but it's possible. You can live and you can thrive on nothing more than that. We have yet more praise for black pepper and turmeric in a green smoothie. Guys, thumbs up if you want us to make a YouTube video. I don't mind. I'm kind of a fan of black pepper. Do we own turmeric? I think we do. We're not using. We have turmeric to use up, so we could do. Black pepper. We have somewhere. I think we don't have a way to crush it. So that's the problem. But yeah, because I've lived in Cambodia and stuff, I'm a bit of a fan of black pepper. My ex-wife was not a black pepper person. Just goes to show we never should have. We never should have been together. But yeah, where do you stand on black pepper? Let's just get really deep here for a minute.
Yeah, I like black pepper.
You're a black pepper?
We
Yeah.
have it ground already. Jar.
Yeah. I don't, in our relationship, I don't remember you eating a lot of black pepper, but maybe that's just circumstance.
I
Yeah.
add it to my pasta.
You do? Okay. Good.
Not all the time.
Yeah. When I make pasta for you, I don't remember you adding black pepper to it. This is not because I'm going to deep complaint. And black pepper is one of those things. People think it all tastes the same. And then you start developing a snobbery for good versus bad black pepper, and you find out it doesn't all taste the same. So yeah, many things are like that in life. There is such a thing as good and excellent black pepper. And like I say, I used to live in Laos. I used to live in Cambodia. So I have some sensitivity to things. Anyway, where today is the great homeland of black pepper? I used to have family living in the great homeland of mustard, Dijon, France. That's another incredibly simple ingredient, but actually has a range of flavor. Okay, guys, thanks for putting up with this digression. This episode has been sponsored by Cambodian black pepper. Yeah, I wish. Get me a sponsor. Okay, so I return to reading this comment from a viewer in the audience. All right. I might as well read the whole thing again rapidly, but you'll see about half of this you haven't heard yet. I only read the first half. Quote, as for being vegan, I understand the health benefits. I have been vegetarian and vegan while I worked at Whole Foods all the way through my college years. But the conundrum I constantly ran into was this. Most vegans' focus is to refuse the use of animal products, but I met very few who realized how nearly impossible it would be. Do they not eat fruit too because the skin is shined with the shellacking of dead insects? Do they build their own houses because the wood caulk used in linoleum uses some parts of horse glue? Do they not drink water out of the sink because some part of the water in some states is filtered using bone shards to clean the water? She means bone char, but still the bones of cattle, etc. That's charred and then used to filter some products. And now I continue the quote, this part you haven't heard before. Quote, for one to truly never hurt any animal, we would be living in houses we built ourselves, clothes we sewed from scratch, and eating veggies and fruits in gardens we nursed ourselves. So pause. A little bit more, right? Pause. Okay. So that is not my definition of veganism. But if that is your definition of veganism, is that such a terrible thing? Are you describing a dystopia? Are you describing hell on earth when you say people stitching their own clothes? Again, that's not my ideal. But if I met someone who strove for that ideal, who just made their own clothes and stuff, and then built I have known some people like that, frankly. I knew a guy who built his own house. It's not worth telling the story. Anyway, I've known various people who build their own house. Remember one guy who built it entirely using, recycled tires. We get old truck tires and you stack them up and then you fill it up with concrete. You pour the concrete and then you make this very stable structure and so on. I've known different eccentrics who did. But do you think you're describing hell on earth when you say this to me? This is not my definition of veganism at all. What you're saying here, from my perspective, it's neither good nor bad. It's irrelevant to veganism. You can be vegan and build your own house, and you can be vegan and rent somebody else's, rent an apartment. To me, it's in this sense, it's spurious. It's irrelevant, right? But that doesn't mean it's good or bad. If you are enthusiastic about architecture, you can build your own house. If you're enthusiastic about, I've known people who made their own clothes. It's not that uncommon. If you're enthusiastic about fashion, you can make your own clothes. This is irrelevant to veganism. Okay. But your implicit point is that not everyone can do it. Therefore, it's impossible. And as I explained at length earlier in the video, when you say impossible, what you really mean is it's unthinkable. For you, you can't think it through. Do you want to drive a fancy car? Do you want to own an Italian car? It's impossible for everyone to own an Italian sports car, a car made in it. It's impossible. China, India, Europe, America, Brazil. Not everyone in the world can own an Italian sports car. Therefore, how dare you? Does that make sense? Therefore, it's impossible for you. Therefore, it's unattainable for you. And again, we got to calibrate these claims about impossibility. Learning to play the piano is really hard. Learning to speak Chinese is hard. For me, owning an Italian sports car would be really hard, guys. It would be. I can't say. I'm now 43 years old. If I made it my goal to own an Italian sports car, an Italian-made sports car by age 53, you tell me, you think I can do it? Some of you guys have done it. Some of you are driving an Italian sports car right now. Support me on Patreon, okay? If you can afford an Italian sports car, you should be paying $5 a month on Patreon to support this YouTube channel. So I have basically zero money in the world now at age 43. Do you think I could have an Italian sports car by 53? Not easy. I could do it. It's not impossible. I could do it. What would it mean to say that it's impossible for everyone in the world to be 100% Italian sports car drivers? Like, what's the point? What's the salience? It seems salient to you. That's why I'm dealing with it in such depth, right? Like, I'm not just going to ridicule it. I'm just going, it's a fallacy. Appeal to nature fallacy, appeal to futility fallacy, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of people on YouTube do this. I'm really talking this through with you. I'm holding your hand as you walk through it. And some of you in the audience, there's going to be someone you love enough, someone you care about enough, someone you respect enough to go through it like this, right? Okay. Not everyone can be a medical doctor. You can. Maybe not your brother, maybe not your sister, but you. What if 100% of the population became medical doctors? Society would implode. Who would farm the food? Who would be a police officer? Who would join the army? Not everyone can be a medical doctor. You can. Should you? Different question. Not everyone can own an Italian-made sports car. Should you? Is it a good idea? I'm open to the possibility maybe nobody should drive an Italian sports car. Like, maybe that's really the ethical conclusion, is that no, this is unfit for human being. I feel nobody should gamble. It's just an example of something I'm totally opposed to. I think nobody should gamble at a casino. Most people disagree with me. They tolerate gambling to whatever extent, right? But maybe you make an argument that fancy sports cars should be banned. But I'm saying some people can own a sports car, and there's just no contradiction in it, right? But okay, what if we lived in a world where 100% of people were trying to own an Italian sports car, and at any given time, 90% of them were failing? Does that sound a lot like life in the United States of America right now? Does that sound a lot like life in California or in Detroit, Michigan? Where everyone lives this consumerist fantasy that they can be the next one to get rich. They can be the next one to have that Italian sports car. It's not everyone in America. A huge percent of the population in America, a huge percentage of people in America, they want to own that sports car. They want to be rich and they want to show off their wealth. That's the set of cultural values. And they know not everyone can win. They know there are going to be winners and losers. Maybe 10% of people are going to get that wealthy that they get to buy that Italian sports car. Okay, so what is it like to live in a society where 100% of people have that impossible, unattainable dream, and where 100% of people are striving for that impossible, unattainable dream, and 90% are failing? Is that hell on earth? Okay, now I want to ask you, what would be so fucking terrible about living in a society where 100% of people want to make their own clothes as a hobby? They just want to buy the cloth and stitch the clothes for their own ethical reasons. Or what is so fucking bad about living in a society where people want to buy an axe and chop lumber and build their own house? You can. I've seen it done. I've seen people building a house with their own hands. One of my grandfathers built his own house. I saw people in Laos and Cambodia doing it with no money in third world conditions. You can watch YouTube videos of people doing it. It's not impossible. Okay, 10-year plan. I'm 43. What's more attainable by 53? Do you think I can learn to stitch my own clothing and build a wooden hut? Live like fucking Henri David Thoreau. I can live like Henry David Thoreau. Make my own hut. I can. That's easy by 50. Of course I can do that next 5 years, next 5 years, next 10 years. You can make a plan. You can too. Okay, but I'm scaling it up here. I don't know if I can buy a fancy sports car 10 years from now. That seems less likely to me, right? It just seems like a less attainable goal. We're going to have $100,000 for the car up front, and then you have all these costs after. Yeah, whatever. I just say, which one is more attainable? You want to build a hut in the woods? You want to stitch your own clothing? You can do it. But this is my point. What if you lived in a culture? And again, these are not my values. It's not my dream. What if you live in a culture where 100% of people idealize that outcome? That's the goal they're working towards. They wish they could make their own clothes. They wish they could build their own house. They wish they could be ethically responsible for the food they eat and the wood that makes up the walls of their house. And they try the best they can, the same fucking way. 99% of people today are trying to get rich or die. They're trying to get rich and they don't care whose neck they have to step on to get it. They're trying to get rich and they don't care how much damage they do. They don't care about the consequences. So many people with this attitude, get rich or die trying. Get rich, and they don't care who they rip off or who gets poor because they're getting rich. So many people want that Italian sports car and want to do any unethical thing for it. All right, that's the dystopia we live in now. What is so fucking bad about living in a society, about living in a dystopia, living in a terrible society where 100% of people are striving for this ideal you describe of being 100% vegan as you define it, not as I define it, being 100% responsible for the wood that's in the rafters of your house and of making your own clothes. All right, that would not be so terrible at all. And yeah, it costs money. Okay, I've done it. I've bought cloth and gone to a tailor and sat there and watched as the tailor made clothes out of the cloth. Well, once you've got the knack down, it doesn't take very many minutes. It only takes a few minutes to make a shirt or a jacket out of a piece of cloth. You can sit there and chit chat with a tailor. Well, now the reason it's easy for the tailor, they've done it 1,000 times before. This is someone who's their hands and their mind has practiced this 1,000 times. They take a piece of chalk and a ruler and they sketch it out. The scissors, you'd be amazed how quick it is. That's why you can do it in a factory too, right? You churn out thousands of shirts. Okay, you can do that. All right, it would cost you some money. You have to own a pair of scissors. You have to own a big flat table. I'm just talking the reality. I've seen a tailor do this in front of us. It's basically all she had. She had a metal ruler, a heavy ruler to hold the fabric flat, a pair of scissors, a piece of chalk, a needle and thread. That costs less than buying an Italian sports car. It probably costs less than one beach vacation anywhere in the world to buy everything you need to make your own clothes. I knew another woman who made her own clothes and dyed them too. So what did she own? She owned a bucket for the dye. She owned a sewing machine. What does a sewing machine cost compared to a car? Secondhand sewing machine versus a secondhand car. Are you kidding me? Secondhand sewing machine compared to a fancy sports car. This costs nothing. It's totally attainable. It's attainable for the working poor. You have a job in a factory and live this fantasy you're talking about. So even if I think it's a stupid fucking fantasy, even if I myself am totally comfortable buying items made in a factory, produced under ethically dubious conditions, I may be comfortable with all kinds of ethical compromises. This is not my ideal of veganism. This is not my ideal of a morally responsible life. But if it is your ideal, one, it's attainable for you. And two, our society is not going to become a dystopia if 100% of people start yearning and striving for it and 90% of people fail, live their whole lives frustrated. There'd be a beautiful society. You're describing a society I'll never know. Okay? What if you lived in a society where the ideal was for everyone to be a medical doctor? 90% of people fail. Maybe 10% of people become a medical doctor. But every kid going through school, they're competing and studying the exams. They're trying to know as much as possible about the history of medical science. They all know the names of the scientists who made great discoveries and breakthroughs. And the people they look up to and admire are the foremost surgeons, the foremost health researchers, the foremost experts in society. And maybe 90% of people have their heart broken because you then have an incredibly competitive system where only the best of the best can become medical doctors. And everyone's proud if they become a medical doctor. Those are your cultural values. Is that a dystopia? Is that a terrible society? It's impossible for 100% of people to be doctors. It's not impossible for 100% of people to want to be medical doctors. Democracy. It's impossible to have 100% of people participate in democracy. It's impossible to have 100% of people participate as equals, specifically. It's right. We can get into a lot of different, more specific definitions of democracy and talk about the ways in which it's impossible to have 100%. Maybe it's even impossible to have 55% of people, right? Okay, but you can have a society where 100% of people strive to have that kind of democracy, where that's the ideal 100% of people want. They want to live in that democracy. They know the difference between life in Thailand and life in Myanmar. They know the difference between life in Thailand and life in Laos, between life in Thailand, life in Cambodia. and say, look, here we are in Thailand. We have some democracy, and we're surrounded by countries that have none, that have zero. And hey guys, let's get motivated. We should all be willing to fight and die to have as much democracy as possible. And maybe Thailand, within my lifetime, can become just as democratic as Japan, just as democratic as South Korea, maybe just as democratic as Switzerland. Can pick different models, right? Can it be as democratic as ancient Athens or something? We can get into real questions this way, all right? Yes, you can have a society where 100% of people try to participate in democracy as equals, and 90% fail, and you have a wonderful society as a result. You fail and fail and fail as individuals, and collectively as a society as a whole, you succeed, right? And the fundamental thesis, or one of the fundamental theses, I think, of Bernard de Mandeville's Fable of the Bees is to get you thinking in this way, the way in which, as a society, in its economic totality, right, everyone can be lying and cheating and stealing, and everyone can be failing. And yet, the economy as a whole, your republic as a whole, your society as a whole, whatever it is, it flourishes. Like it flourishes. The aggregate of all these bad intentions can produce something positive. And if you go to Los Angeles right now, I think there's a sense, even if it's a really cynical sense, right? There's a really cynical sense in which you can say the dynamism of Los Angeles is created by all these people who want to get rich. They may have terrible motivations and they all want to own that Italian sports car. They all want to drive down Sepulveda Boulevard in their Italian sports car. It's a terrible motivation. And yet a certain kind of positive dynamism comes out of it. Wanting to be ethically responsible for the construction materials your house is made of is a wonderful motivation to have. And wonderful things come out of it. Wanting to be a medical doctor, in some ways it's wonderful, in some ways it's horrible. Okay, how does that compare to a society where everyone just wants to get rich and they don't care who they have to stab in the back, who they have to lie to, cheat or steal, whose neck they have to step on? Politics is centrally about impossible things. Peace is impossible. The only peace you're ever going to have is in the shadow of war. Politics is entirely about creating and sustaining peace, no matter how phony, insincere, tragic, self-abnegating the basis is. Something as simple as that. Equality is impossible in a million ways. Sorry, if you don't have brothers and sisters, you can't visualize this. I'm not equal to my brothers and sisters. We have, the same genetics approximately. I have more genetically in common with my brothers and sisters than anyone else on planet Earth, so far as I understand the science, right? Even a half brother, right? Even a half sister. I have more in common with them genetically than anyone else on the planet. They're not my equals, and they can't be, and they won't be. You don't even want to try to be my equals. And some of you know what this is like. Some of you don't. You have brothers and sisters who are alcoholics or whatever, let alone when you look at society as a whole. Just think about your grade 6 class, the kids you used to sit down in the classroom with in grade 6. You're not all equals, right? You can yearn for equality, right? You can try for the impossible. You can aim for the impossible. You can have a society of people who desire equality, right? And work toward that impossible goal. And a lot of positive things can come out of trying and failing, right? You can have a whole society that yearns for atheism, yearns for a secular scientific society. But I'm just going to say atheism because I think it's more honest. We're never going to have 100% atheism. I've met people, there are people who are born and raised atheists. They have atheist parents, and they nevertheless go out on their own and join a crazy cult and become, it happens all the time. My point is like reinventing the wheel. People will reinvent barbaric notions. Okay. We can yearn for, we can strive for a 100% atheist society instead of resigning ourselves to right? The darkness of the dark ages going on forever. And so much that's positive will come out of that yearning, that trying, that failure, right? So the impossible, it's not some kind of footnote in political science. Politics is really centrally and integrally about the impossible. Two types of impossible things: thinkable and unthinkable. And what people like me try to do, dissident intellectuals, creative artists, right, is to take things that are unthinkable and make them thinkable. To take you hand in hand and ask you to step with me into the truly unknown, to get you asking yourself questions you've never asked before, to get you coming up with answers you've never thought of before, right? It's very easy to think it's impossible to have an atheist society, right? Again, during the French Revolution, think about how new and different this was, right? It's very easy for people to resign themselves to the thought that a vegan society is impossible. Everything seems impossible when you haven't done it before. In the year 1850, a society with fundamental equality between black people and white people seemed impossible. A society that was fundamentally accepting of homosexuals seemed impossible. Okay, 100 years later in 1950, still for the vast majority of Americans, for the vast majority of people in Western Europe, those things seemed impossible. Political equality for blacks and whites, political equality for homosexuals and heterosexuals. In 1950 in Europe, look at how many countries women could even vote in Europe, right? It seemed unthinkable, right? And people like me had to make it thinkable, right? But some of these things you're talking about as impossible, they're not just possible, they're thinkable, and they're very powerful in shaping political discourse in our times. All right, guys. If you guys have another question, you have a comment, now's a good time to leave it. You can hit thumbs up. The rest of what this guy wrote to me under this heading, I'm going to turn off my phone now. I don't think there's anything more worth reading. The rest of what he said very much fell into our great European tradition of judge not, lest you be judged. And I'm talking about this because it's linked in his mind, and I think it's linked in the minds of many people in the modern world. So point one is veganism is impossible, all right? An unattainable ideal for individuals and scaling it up for society as a whole. That's the claim. I've just refuted this or responded to this thoroughly for 3 hours solid. Okay. And then linked to this is this great canard in our civilization of judge not, lest you be judged. You shouldn't think you're morally superior to anyone else. You shouldn't think your ethical ideas are better than anyone else's. We're all just poor sinners, et cetera, et cetera. Now, guys, I don't have to repeat myself. There is a moral difference between George W. Bush and Al Gore, all right? And you do not have to believe that Al Gore, pardon me, you do not have to believe that Al Gore is a good person. You do not have to believe he is a great person. Al Gore was a better person than George W. Bush. And that difference that you may think of as quite subtle or hard to see, like it's not obvious at first glance, it's not just worth voting for. It's not just worth talking about. It's worth fighting and dying for. Okay. I think the American people should hang their heads in shame that there wasn't a civil war when it was revealed as a matter of fact that the elections in Florida were fraudulent that year. Okay, now, I mean, this is an objective fact. There was fraud. It was an illegitimate election in the state of Florida. Not the whole United States of America. In one state, in Florida, it was a manipulated election. And that one state decided the outcome, right? It was a very close election. Who was willing to stand up and fight and die for democracy? Who was willing to stand up and fight and die for Al Gore? Nobody. All right. And I've got to tell you something. There's a real sense in which that's the death of democracy in America, because it reflects the profound inertia, the profound indifference towards democracy that continues to be prevalent to this day. Far be it from me to suggest that every problem in democracy can be solved by civil war or violence. But, you should read Machiavelli's discourses on this. Not Machiavelli's The Prince, Machiavelli's Discourses, two different books. Machiavelli's Discourses are really the important one. But Machiavelli was one of those guys who was really willing to be honest about the extent to which, if you want to have a republic, you have to be willing to pay the price in blood, not just once, every generation, again and again and again. I think there are a lot of people in Afghanistan right now who are hanging their heads in shame, asking, why didn't more of us fight for democracy? And by the way, that will include a lot of moderate Muslims. There are a lot of people in Afghanistan who are Muslim. They're just less Muslim than the Taliban, less religious than the Taliban, who are now hanging their heads in shame, saying, look, we had a better society. We had the possibility of a much better society flourishing and growing out of it. But we were not willing to pay the price in blood. There were not enough heroes among us who stood up to fight and die for that. Now, I'll give you a parallel in Western Europe. In case you didn't hear, at one point, France got conquered by the Nazis. Remember that? Now, eventually, with time, there was this grassroots guerrilla movement that resisted the Nazis that developed. But guys, the reality of the extent to which the French elite and French institutions just began working for the Germans, the extent to which the French became a colony of the Germans and became implicated in and part of the fascist history of Germany, is it's such a source of national shame that you will nowhere see it mentioned in any French history textbooks. The extent to which France and Germany from that point on were on the same side in World War II. People like to say the Vichy regime, V-I-C-H-Y. If you don't know the history of it, it's worth looking at. And France has had to hang its head in shame ever since. The French have had to be aware there just were not enough heroes in France. There were not enough people willing to fight and die for the future of democracy. So this is my response to the trope. All of you are going to have to deal with it, even if you're watching this and you're not vegan. This trope, who are you to judge? This idea that ethically we're all equal. Okay. No, we're not. George W. Bush is not ethically equal to Al Gore. All right. Field Marshal Pétain, the man who took over France and ruled it on behalf of the Nazis, hand in glove with the Germans, he's not ethically equal to having a democratically elected president and prime minister, et cetera, in a French society. He's not. The difference between Pétain and the democratic alternative to Pétain, however you want to think of that, whether you think of it as the prime minister had to flee for his life, or think of it as whoever would have hypothetically replaced Pétain after Revolutionary War, Civil War was fought against Pétain and Pétainisme and fought against Vichy or something. Okay, no, it really matters. Okay, I mean, again, whatever with Germany, again, there's no easy personality to oppose to Adolf Hitler. The difference between Adolf Hitler and whoever would have ruled Germany, hypothetically, if you had a democratic society, you had elections, Stalin, and whoever would have hypothetically ruled Russia, if you had a real working democracy and elections. The dictator of North Korea right now, and if you want to say compare it to the reality of government in South Korea, or again, the hypothetical government they could have. No, ethically, we have to deal with fundamental inequalities, great and small. Some people are stupid. Some people are lazy. Some people are ignorant. And some people are cowards. All I can ask you is, what about you? What kind of person are you going to be? And what now? What next? In the next 5 years? In the next 50 years? With that self-knowledge, with that awareness of your own specialness relative to George W. Bush, relative to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, certainly relative to the imbeciles we've had leading the vegan movement. Every single one of you in this audience is more intelligent than James Aspie. I suspect most of you are more intelligent than AOC, Ocasio-Cortez. I suspect. Maybe I'm wrong. But every single one of you is smarter than Durian Ryder. Every single one of you is smarter than James Aspie. I go on and on. Every single one of you is smarter than Nina and Randa Nelson, right? None of you are taking away the leadership role from them, right? None of you are leading the positive ecological and ethical change we all know we desperately need as we count down the years towards irreversible damage due to climate change, as we count down the years with billions of animals being tortured to death and all this other stuff, right? It's real easy to think, oh, hypothetically, what you would have done if you were alive in France during World War II. Hypothetical. It's not hypothetical, right? The revolution is now. It's happening all the time, or it's not happening all the time because of your laziness, your indolence. What happened back in the year 2000 elections with George W. Bush taking over the government when there was fraud in Florida? Who stood up? Who fought? Who showed some backbone? Who said democracy is worth fighting and dying for? And you refused to be ruled by a government that wasn't legitimately elected due to palpable fraud, legally provable. I mean, palpable. There was physical evidence of the fraud. I don't want to get into all the details here. Okay, it's not a matter of opinion. There was palpable, irrefutable evidence of the fraud that happened in the state of Florida. All right? Through your silence, through your conformity, through your complicity, you too become part of the problem. And when people look back on those events, just as they look back on what happened in France during World War II, right? What's most astonishing of all is the ease and comfort of continuing in your bourgeois existence instead of rising to the challenge, instead of pressing for the fundamental social, culture, and political change that we all know is necessary. I'm addressing this video to those who will be heroes, whether they know it or not.